Hey everyone, today we're going to be getting our last lecture in our discussion over Eastern religions. And today we're going to be looking at primarily the ancient indigenous religion of Japan that is known as Shinto. So, as always, when we begin our lectures on any world religion, we talk about some basic facts about a world religion. And so let's talk about some basic facts of the religion of Shinto. Shinto is a polytheistic, animistic, and syncretistic indigenous religion. That's a lot of istics, but we'll break those down here in a second. So again, Shinto is a polytheistic, animistic, and syncretistic indigenous religion of Japan that revolves around the belief in supernatural entities called kami. Now, you may be asking yourself, what is a kami? What the hell is a kami? Very briefly, I just want to give a brief definition here, and we'll talk about this more in depth later on in this lecture. But what a kami are deities, spirits, mythological beings, natural phenomenons, and/or holy sacred powers that are venerated in the religion of Shinto. So that's what a kami is. So we will discuss more what a kami is later, but I want you to keep this very brief definition in your mind as we build some of the background information, as we talk about the origins of Shinto. We will be talking about kami a lot early on, but I'll break down a better definition later on in this lecture. But just keep this simple definition in mind. When I say kami, I'm referring to spirits and/or the mythological gods of the indigenous religion of Japan, that is Shinto. So just keep that in mind. So let's break down some of these characteristics that we talked about with Shinto. We haven't really mentioned some of these terms in a long time, so I want to break some of these down for you here. So let's break down some of this definition that we see, some of these words in the definition of Shinto. So let's look at indigenous religion. So if you recall, an indigenous religion is a category used in the study of religion to demarcate the religious belief systems of a community that is either ancient or that is still in existence today, who this community is described as being indigenous to the landscape or to the geography, as well as the religion itself. So when you think of indigenous religions, or if you think of indigenous cultures today in the United States, that applies to Native Americans. Native Americans who are indigenous to the landscape of the United States, to North America. And so those religious belief systems aren't found anywhere else. They're not found in Europe. They're not found in Africa. They're not found in Australia. There may be some characteristics, there may be some broad similarities, but by and large, the same practices that are done by the Cherokee Indians or the Inuit Indians of Alaska, they're not elsewhere. They're not found elsewhere. They're not found in Africa. They're not found in East Asia. They are, quote unquote, indigenous to that landscape and to that region. So that's what we're talking about here. Shinto, for much of its for its history, for the predominant history up until the last almost 100 years, Shinto has only been found in the I can't say that word. Archipelago, I can't even say it, the islands. I'm trying to use a fancy term here, but the islands of Japan. There, Shinto is an indigenous religion that's only found inside the islands of Japan. But however, that's changed in the last 100 years with the Empire of Japan, and we'll talk about that here briefly. But at the heart of this religion, it's an indigenous religion. So that's why I want to talk about this one, because it's much different than some of the other indigenous religions that we have discussed, something like Hinduism or Jainism that has since spread beyond its borders. Shinto, for much of its history, has always been isolated to the Isles of Japan. And so, because of its indigenous status, the origins of Shinto is quite mysterious, and there's really no certain date that we have, no certain source of origins that we have to the beginnings, the roots of Shinto. So thus Shinto is very much like Hinduism that we've already discussed so far. That Hinduism has this murky origins, has various theories that have been proposed. The most prominent one is the Aryan migration theory or the Aryan invasion theory, of how um, what we would recognize as Hinduism, how it emerged on the subcontinent. You'll see some parallels when we get to the origins of Shinto as well. Shinto, like Hinduism, has no founder. There is no founder of the religion, so thus we cannot classify, nor would we classify Shinto as a founder religion. It is something different. Its characteristics, its makeup is very similar to Hinduism, so keep those comparisons in mind. Um, also, Shinto is not a proselytizing religion or a missionary religion. It doesn't go out and advocate for its faith. People don't actively convert to Shinto. Rather, Shinto is a ethno religion. It is something that people are born into, and then thus it's predominantly a religion that is exclusively tied to the Japanese culture and Japanese ethnicity. However, that has changed a little bit, very little bit, not even 1%, of the entire population of Shinto is now not Japanese, who might be Chinese or Korean or some of the island Pacificers. And that's only because of the histories surrounding the rise of the Empire of Japan prior to World War II. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit. So that's indigenous religion, but let's look at some other terms that we have up here. Um, Polytheism. Let's start with that first term up there, polytheism. Now, this is a term that we're quite familiar with. We've already seen this term before with Hinduism, but we're going to do a little bit of refresher here because we haven't talked about polytheism in quite some time. So, what is polytheism? Polytheism refers to a belief system and the existence of multiple gods and goddesses who are often viewed as having individual personalities, traits, and responsibilities that are associated with either specific natural phenomenons or specific human characteristics or aspects of human life. So, for example, in Greek mythology, the god Zeus is associated with lightning, with storms, the god of the thunderbolt. Also, you have inside of Greek mythology, you have Aphrodite, who's associated with human aspects, characteristics like the goddess of love. You'll have those same elements here within Shinto as well. Other spirits, other kami within the religion of Shinto have these similar aspects. Some that are associated with lightning, storms, with the sun, with the moon, others with certain characteristics, fate, greed, jealousy, love, intellect, wisdom, things like that. You see this as well. But for the term animism here, animistic, we haven't really encountered this word since really the beginning with E.B. Tyler, that we've already discussed in this course. So I want to bring this up again because this is the first religion in which we do see this in full tilt. What is animism? Animism is the belief that all objects, places, and creatures possess a distinct spiritual essence, are who are distinctly perceived as animated. That's where you get the term animism. They're animated. They are alive, meaning that individuals believe items such as trees have spirits, have little gods inside them, because it's an explanation tool. It's an explanation tool is why do trees grow from little saplings into great massive things like the sequoia redwood tree that you have out in California? How can it grow from a very small spot to something very massive? It has a spirit inside, just like humans. Humans grow from little infants into 5'5", 5'11", 6'5" beings. It's because that spirit inside us makes our body grow. They apply that same basic logic, that same observational science that our ancient relatives and indigenous cultures have seen, and they apply that to what they can understand about the world. Humans grow, humans move because they have breath. Humans stop moving. They stop growing. They die. Their body decomposes because the breath has left them. They have a spirit that's inside them, and when the breath leaves, the spirit leaves their body. Animals must have this, trees must have this, mountains must have this, because it explains their movements, it explains their sources. It explains why a tree produces fruit, why a tree either withers and dies, why a mountain can produce clouds and storms, or it can cause avalanches and eruptions, because there is some cause behind it. Thus, our indigenous cultures applied a spirit to that. Another term for many of these animistic religions, and another term that could apply to Shinto as well, is the term of nature religions or natural religions. A nature religion or a natural religion is a religious movement that believes nature and the natural world are an embodiment of the divine, their embodiment of deity itself, of sacredness itself, or of sacred spiritual powers in of itself. However, nature religions rarely form their religious beliefs into visible socio-political political structures and institutions like churches or temples. Typically, many of these natural religions are very primitive and their makeup and their hierarchy and their structure. And so this is where the term natural religion doesn't really apply to Shinto, because Shinto does develop into a complex religious organization and structures. And so a lot of people don't use this term. But I want to apply that there. So when you think of natural religions, you're thinking of the Native American and their religious traditions. Or you're thinking of the ancient Druids of the British and Irish Isles that have no permanent structure or institutions. Shinto doesn't really fit into this categorization, even though it has some belief systems that go with it. Animism as a term is used in anthropology and the anthropology of religion as a term that describes systems for many indigenous peoples. And animism is described to be the most common, the foundational thread of all religions, as well as indigenous cultures. So Shinto seems to have, well, let me rephrase it this way, that Shinto seems to have a low status bar, priority bar in our discussions of religion, because it seems to be quite primitive within the field of anthropology. I don't think that's the case, but I wanted to bring that notion out to you here. The last term that I want to look at from our definition is syncretism, real quick. As for syncretism, it involves assimilation or merging of several different beliefs, practices, and traditions into a new underlying unity of faith and culture. Um, Religious syncretism is a blending of those religious systems, many religious systems, into a new singular incorporated religious belief system. And so you will see that Shinto has some of these elements, and we'll talk about that later on. So there's many examples of that religious syncretism throughout world history. So the most famous example is the blending of Greek and Egyptian mythology during the Hellenistic period, that after Alexander the Great conquered the known world, particularly in Egypt, you saw the conscious blending together of Greek and Egyptian cultures. Historians call that interpretatio gracia. You'll later see that with Roman culture as well as the Roman Empire expands, and so that's also termed interpreto romano. But interpretatio gracia is that blending together of cultures. So, for example, the god Osiris in Egyptian culture gets assimilated as being similar, if not the same, as the Greek god Zeus, the sky god. Osiris is not so much the sky god, but he is the pantheon of all the Egyptian gods, just like Zeus is. Osiris has a partner, Isis, a female counterpart who is his cohort, who helps also rule the Egyptian pantheon as well. Zeus has one as well, Hera, and so Hera and Isis also get blended together at certain times and aspects. So we see that's another example that we've already talked about in this course, Sikhism. Sikhism is a syncretic religion. It combined elements of Hinduism and Sufi Islam into a new religious institution. Shinto, to an extent, is that as well. And we'll talk about how a certain period of Shinto history, it did combine elements of Japanese folk religions with Buddhism that emerged on the culture. And so the name of that we'll get to is Shinbutsu Shugo, and we'll talk about that later. Um, as we have witnessed with most of the Eastern religions that we've talked about so far in this course, that providing a clear and accurate demography of data for practitioners of a particular religion within the Eastern traditions, Eastern categories of religion, can be quite difficult. And the same is for Shinto itself. Most Japanese participate in several religious traditions. They don't participate in one singular religion. If you poll them, they will self-identify as Buddhist, as Shinto, as Confucian, Taoism, Christian. Um, they'll identify themselves as several things because that's how their culture is built. They don't see religion as this separate entity. So thus, it's not always possible to differentiate in Japanese society and culture a Shintoist from a Buddhist in Japan. So it's very problematic. Another issue is that many Japanese avoid the term religion because they dislike the connotation of the word religion within their own language. So if you recall, from our very first lecture that we talked about, from our introductory lectures of religion, that religion, for most of the world, religion is a secondary category. It's a category that was in a term, a vocabulary that was created by Western cultures and introduced into their own cultures through European colonization and European exposure. So the term religion is not native to these various cultures instinctively. It's a term that was brought over by Westerners. It was a word that was created by Westerners to describe what they did. And then when Westerners came, Europeans came and started to colonize various regions in Asia, they started to apply what they saw as this must be religion. So within Japanese culture, if you were to translate the word religion into Japanese, it would be shuko. Shuko, Shukyo, shuko. Or sometimes you might see the word shinshuko, which is ShinshuKyo. That term, shuko, is more associated with the word cult or a sect. It doesn't really mean a very positive thing. In Japanese culture, it's a negative thing. It's a foreign word. It refers to sex, refers to cults that even in our Western cultures, we tend to avoid. We have a negative connotation when we think of a cult. If we think of a sect, we try to run away from it. We avoid this connotation. The same thing within Japanese culture. But that's the word that they would use for religion, a cult. And so this is why it's very hard to give some type of polling data within Japanese cultures because of the term religion has a very negative connotation. Instead, Japanese would use words like dinto, meaning which means tradition, or shukan, meaning custom, to describe what they believe in their practices. So they would use different words. They would use more common words like, oh, this is just my family tradition. This is just my daily routine. This is my daily tradition, just the traditions that I do of wake up every morning. I mean, we have those types of traditions that we do, those routines, those customs that we do, that we brush our teeth a certain way, that we have a nightly ritual that we do. Japanese see religion similar in a similar vein. Just this daily routine, this daily custom, this daily practice that we do. And so it's not so much religion for them, it's just a part of their day-to-day practices. It's part of their family traditions and cultures. So it makes it very hard to identify what Shinto is. But we do have some data, and I want to share with you some of that data here. So according to official statistics from 2018, before the pandemic, um, that data showed that Shinto was to be Japan's largest religion. Around 71% of its population engaged in some type of daily Shinto activities in their lives. So that's around 89 million of Japanese of their overall 127 million that make up the population of Japan. 89 million followers of Shinto, according to official data done by the government in 2018. However, that data is highly questionable. The reason is because if conversely private questionnaires were also sent by other institutions that coincided with this data collection that were to inquire about Japanese religions and cultures, and that according to those private questionnaires, only a small majority of Japanese self identified themselves as followers of Shinto, around 3%, or better yet, 3.8 million, around 4, we'll give it 4 million Japanese describe themselves as being followers of Shinto, while 62% of the population says that they believe in no religion at all. They might do it, they might practice it, they might do these customs, but they don't believe in it because, again, they see it as part of a family tradition, just a family custom, custom of being Japanese. You do some of these Shinto traditions, but in their heart of hearts, if we were to say and use that term, they don't believe it. 62% of Japanese populations don't believe in a religion, but they do it. They do Buddhist traditions, they do Shinto traditions, but they see it as just being part of Japanese culture and traditions. So, thus, it makes it very difficult to get a true grasp of the demographics of Shinto as a religion. So, generally, statisticians and religious scholars and religious number crunchers would say that really the Japanese culture that would truly self identify themselves as Shinto can fall anywhere between 17% of the population of Japan, around 21 million, to 27%, so around 34 million, actively believe and actively practice Shinto in their lives. So it's a very small majority, but we really don't know. And that's one of the problems. The last question that I want to go before we change into a new topic here is to ask the question, if Shinto is this indigenous religion of Japan, then can it be a world religion? Why are we discussing it? This question has really divided scholars. Those who argue Shinto is a world religion will point to the recent history of Shinto, particularly the imperial history of Japan in the modern era. So from 1868 until 1945, they'll point to a time period when the religion shifted to being aspect of a global religion, in which the Empire of Japan established Shinto as a state religion of the empire and used it as part of their military expansion into other countries within East Asia. And part of that military expansion, the Empire of Japan also established Shinto shrines in foreign countries. And so many scholars would point to this is the fact, the first establishments of a world religion, because, well, Islam did this too. Christianity did this as well. We see roots of these recognized, confirmed world religions being done in the behaviors and the practices of Japan, but in a very modern period. In addition, those who are in the pro religion world camp would cite recent Japanese migration patterns to the United States and to Europe and to other areas of East Asia, where they have thus, in turn, have established small minority of Shinto shrines outside of Japan. So, because of globalization since the 1960s and beyond, that Japan and its culture and its religion have spread beyond its borders. And that's very true. But those who argue against Shinto being included into the family of world religions point to its lack of centrality, of authority, of sacred text, of really even a definition of Shinto. And we'll talk about the problems there later. Shinto doesn't have really any singular set of beliefs. It has no creed. It has no ruling, governing body, quote unquote. It sort of does, but not. That's a really relatively modern invention, uh, but it really doesn't. Shinto practices, beliefs can vary between Japanese cultures within their own island, from city to city, sometimes down to neighborhood, can vary widely and have significant variety. So many people say it's not really much a religion as it is a culture, a set of practices and traditions. So Shinto, they argue, is seen more as a way of life rather than a way of doing religion. And many Japanese people would agree with that. They would identify Shinto as just merely practices. And people who do Shinto practices also conversely do Buddhist practice. You will very much see this happen in Japan today, that you'll see somebody go to a Buddhist shrine in Japan, make prayers, do the rituals of a Buddha and of a Buddhist, and then just turn around and go next door to a Shinto shrine and do practices and traditions there. It's just part and part of their culture. So thus Shinto is not seen as a world religion, it's seen as a part of their culture, they would argue. For me, if I'm going to show my cards on the table, I'm very much in the pro world religion camp. Shinto does carry other elements of a world religion, not so much singular, centrality and organization and creeds and stuff like that. But Shinto does carry elements of Japanese mythology, of ritualization, of an understanding of a cosmology of how the world is supposed to operate. How do you operate within that world? These are very basic elements within other religions. It has a recognized priesthood, which helped to clearly establish for me Shinto as a world religion, or primarily as a religion. And because of the migration of Japanese culture and the movement of people throughout the globe after World War II, it has led to me recognizing Shinto as a world religion. So, our next point is we need to ask the question, is Shinto a religion? We've kind of already touched on some of this, but I think it's important and prudent for us to discuss the complex nature of Shinto as a religion. So, first off, there's really no universally agreed definition for Shinto, as its traditions are quite corrupted by the advent and adoption of Buddhism on the islands of Japan, and the practice of Shinto can vary from region to region. The famed Japanese, or how you say, I guess, Japanese historian, Japanese cultural historian, Helen Hardacre has stated that if we were to give a definition to Shinto, we would say that it's merely a collection of traditions that encompass a variety of beliefs, rituals, the communal life based on kami worship. Others, like the world religion scholar Nina Smart, would argue against that definition, would argue that while kami worship has existed in Japan and is well attested to as far back as the 300s BCE, uh, what we recognize as Shinto is largely an invented category of the last 300 years, Nina Smart would say. Other scholars within his vein would say in the last 100 years that it's an invented category. Um, so scholars like Brian Brian Bocking, stressed that the term Shinto, especially, that we can't really deal with the religion of Shinto before the Meiji period of Japanese history, and we'll talk about the Meiji period here shortly, that we really can't talk about what is Shinto. We can't speak of a religion of Shinto before the 1860s and 1870s, when it was created as an extent by the empire and the emperor of Japan and his government. That if we do talk about things from antiquities of Japan, we should be really extremely cautious because we don't have clear and precise definitions. So, really, why all of this caution concerning a world religion like Shinto? Why are scholars hedging their bets, per se? Well, as we've already alluded to in this lecture, the issue evolves around the way that Japanese have historically seen Shinto. And that's the reason for this. That until the arrival of Saint Francis of Xavier, who was a Catholic Jesuit priest, who arrived with his Portuguese missionaries shortly after the arrival of Portuguese traders in 1549 to the Isles of Japan, that prior to Saint Francis, the Japanese really had no concept of religion. As again, as I stressed before, the term religion really did not exist in their own language and at this time. They had no concept of what this is. At the time, practitioners of Shinto instead would view their practices as simply as a way of life, of way of doing life. They would characterize them more as customs or traditions of either their family clan, traditions and customs of their particular region, or just traditions and customs of concerning what it means to be Japanese. They did not see what they did as religion. They had no concept of what was religion. It's not until after the arrival of Catholicism to Japan, and particularly the reign of Toyomati Hideyoshi, who reigned around 1584 to almost 1600, that when he issued the banishment of Christian practices in his country, that really did you see a working definition and a working understanding of what religion is. That, in a sense, the Japanese were reacting to Christianity. They were reacting to Catholic priests in their country. And they began to first, at this time, slowly start to understand what the Catholics were doing, what the Europeans were doing as religion, and then starting to understand what they traditionally did, Shinto and Buddhism, as religion as well, that this is the religion of the Japanese versus the religion of the colonizers or the Europeans, being Catholicism. And so, if you know your Japanese history, that shortly after Hideyoshi's um, rule and then the establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate in 1603 till really the time of the Meiji period in 1868, that Japan began, for about a 30-year period in the early 1600s, began a eradication of Christian elements within Japan. Martin Scorsese's 2015 movie Silence is a good movie that documents the tail end of the end days of Catholicism and Christian communities in Japan. And we'll talk more about that later. So that's something that you need to keep in mind, is that history. How did the Japanese see what they did? See Shinto. They did not really see Shinto as a religion until they experienced and encountered Western cultures, until they experienced and encountered European traders, until they experienced and encountered Catholicism. Did they now have a sense and a small understanding and a growing understanding of what religion is? So they did not, again, they did not see what they did as religion. Rather, they saw it as just simply, this is what it means to be Japanese, versus adopting Catholicism. They saw that as adopting European customs, which the Japanese at that time were violently against. Another aspect to keep in mind is that, and we've already talked about this in our first few lectures, so you were seeing this kind of circle back, especially with this lecture of Shinto, that we need to keep in mind that religion as a concept is very much a Western ideology. Western religions tend to stress exclusivity, but in Japan, it has long been considered and acceptable to practice different religious traditions and to practice them simultaneously. As I said before, even to this day, if you go to Japan, you will see that the average Japanese would practice both Shinto and Buddhist practices, even sometimes during the same day. They would do those things. That certain aspects of life, the Japanese have compartmentalized their religious traditions. That for a child's birth, they would go see a Buddhist shrine. They might go see a Bodhisattva um, to pray to ask for blessings and things like that. But they might then at the same time go to Shinto practices to ask their ancestors for help, ask the kami for help with the child's safety and health as well. So you can see there that they do these things simultaneously. And that was what it was for Japan for many, many centuries. They did not see a clear distinction between Buddhism and Shinto. Some did, but the majority didn't. And we'll talk about the reasons why that is here a little bit later. So in some areas of Japan, Shinto shrines actually share the same spaces as those with Buddhist temples. And sometimes Shinto priests perform Buddhist ceremonies, and vice versa. You'll see Buddhist priests performing Shinto ceremonies, or Buddhist monks. So they really don't have priests, but you get the logistics of here. It's a very much a blended society with their religious practices. So all in all, this complicated issue for us as religious scholars who are more used to having and dealing with Western religions, who have clear demarcations, because these religions like Christianity, Judaism, Islam teach and preach that there is such thing as exclusivity, that you should be devoted to one religion and not the other, that the other religion is false, their religion is the true religion. Again, in Buddhism and Shinto, those concepts didn't exist. So it's very important for us to realize this biases when we approach Shinto. And that's why Shinto is a very important lecture that I wanted to include in our class here, because it hits at the heart of this early conversation that we had at the very beginning about being aware of our Western biases. Therefore, there has been a growing movement, not only within scholarship, but also Japanese historians and scholars and circles, to simply classify Shinto as merely as an expression of Japanese culture, an expression of native cultures from the past. That's kind of been the growing trend. And while it's true that religion, as we discussed again back to our early lectures, that religion is very much an expression of culture, and culture is very much an expression of religion. We see that with scholars like Emil Durkheim, scholars like Clifford Geertz, that we've already discussed previously in this course. I believe that we can say with some level of certainty that Shinto is a religion and that we should treat it as such because it betrays certain characteristics that we see from other religions. And so I will follow the famed Shinto theologian Ninu Nokobata, who once indicated that Shinto should be considered as an integral part of the family of East Asian religions, and that we should, when we discuss other East Asian cultures, other East Asian religions like Nichiren Buddhism, Pure Land Buddhism, if we talk about Confucianism, Taoism, that we should include Shinto because it has a vital, integral part of not only the culture but also the history of the island. As again today, you see remnants of a working established religion today. That if you did not have these cultures and these traditions prior to the Meiji period, you would not have modern day forms of Shinto today. So that's why I agree that this is a religion and that we should treat it as such. So for me, Shinto has a clear mythology of Japan's founding as a people, as an island nation, and as a culture. It has a clear presentation and an explanation of the supernatural world that many religions have. You'll see similar paradigms within Buddhism, within Hinduism, within Christianity or Judaism that you find in Shinto as well. And Shinto for me has concrete and established rituals and institutions, and its practitioners pray to, venerate, and appease spiritual entities. So, again, all of these are trademarks of what we would classify as a religion. So, if we go back to that very first lecture again, where it talked about the comparison between pornography and religion, or that comparison between which ones are the two flags, if we go back to even Justice Potter Stewart's or Stuart Potter explanation of pornography. I know it when I see it. Shinto fits this category. I know it when I see it. And so when you look at the elements of Shinto, if you go to Japan and look at how the average Japanese performs Shinto rituals, you're looking at a religion. It looks like it feels like it smells like it sounds like it. So if it looks like it, if it walks like a duck, talks like a duck, it's a duck. In this instance, if it looks like a religion, talks like a religion, smells like a religion, behaves like a religion, sounds like a religion, it's probably a religion. So the next question that we need to ask ourselves is really, how did it all begin? Well, it is well, first it's important for me here to note that when we have traditionally have discussed various religions up to this point, it's very commonplace for us to put the suffix ism or ian, like Muslims or Buddhism or Jainism. or Taoism. We might use the suffix IAN to Christians, Confucians. That we would put this at the end of the word to describe its followers or describe its beliefs. So when we talk about religions and beliefs concerning Buddha, we talk about Buddhism. When we talk about followers of Confucius, we talk about Confucians. But for the religion of Shinto, there's really no such thing as the English word Shintoism, nor do we call the followers of Shinto Shintoians. You simply just say Shinto or followers, believers of Shinto. There's no need to say Shintoism or Shintoist. That's a very common mistake that I see from students that make and novice in the world of religious studies. As I said, again, you don't need to say that. It's just simply Shinto, followers of Shinto. And a lot of it has to do with the language of Japanese, that where this doesn't exist. So, but however, you may see the word Shintoist used to describe practitioners, followers of Shinto, meaning you might see the ending ISTS or just IST. However, that term is still incorrect, as again, it's too westernized, and followers of Shinto see itself um, as being uh, a westernization of their traditions, and so they don't like it. It's just simply Shinto, and so that's an important point that I want to say that. And so for me, it's a term that I don't use and don't prefer to use as well. It's just I learned it as Shinto, and that's how I accept it as Shinto. And so that's what we're going to do here for us today. The second important thing to mention concerns the history and etymology of the word Shinto. First, the word Shinto derives from a combination of two Chinese characters or two Chinese words. The character Shin, Shen, Shin, which means spirit or can sometimes mean God, or it can be plural for spirits and gods as well. And the Chinese character Dao, which we've already seen discussed with Taoism, depending on your pronunciation of the term, Dao. And so we already know what that means. That it's just simply a Chinese word that means the way or the path. And so you put those together, the Chinese and our ancient Chinese sources, our earliest sources concerning Shinto and Japanese practices come from China. And so the Chinese would use the word Shindao to refer to the religion of the Japanese, and they saw it as something similar to what they believed in. So thus that kind of connection there with Taoism and Shinto, so the way of the spirit or the way of the gods. And like I said, in these writings, the Chinese would refer to the Japanese traditions as Shindo. And so that word eventually becomes transplanted to Japan once Chinese missionaries from who are Buddhist Chinese missionaries, travelers, emissaries, when Japan later in its history started to adopt Chinese um, practices, customs, cultures, this word naturally bleeded into their society and culture. So it's very important to remember that first, the word itself, Shinto, is not native to Japan. It is a what we would call a borrowed word from another language, Chinese, that had made its way into Japanese culture. So again, that's very important for us to know. Second, the word Shinto really emerged in reaction to the advent and the growing dominance of Buddhism in Japan. So, according to the earliest sources of Chinese history, and so the earliest sources of the Chinese history is a set of texts known as the Ninhoin Soki or Sokai Chronicles. These are the second oldest books to have been written and discovered in Japan. And these chronicle the Japanese history from its mythology, its creation myths, to around prior to the year 720 CE. Now, some of these writings, some of these historical notes are largely fictional, but however, there are some historical elements. And so they do preserve here a story of how Buddhism arrived to Japan, which seems to be historically accurate in its retelling, and so is thus accepted as the traditional story. However, there's evidence similar to China that has an official story, but then archaeologists, scholars, historians have also seen that that Buddhism came to China much earlier than the sources have indicated. Same here with Japan; they seem to be maybe a century earlier before the sources give it its credence, before it has an official welcoming, meaning that Buddhism probably arrived through natural traders, fishermen who traveled between the Korean Peninsula, the Chinese mainland, for trade and commerce before it was officially presented to um, the leadership, as the story goes. But anyhow, back to the Nihon Soki Chronicles. So according to them, that they cite that the king of modern day South Korea, Seong, or Sejong, sent a mission, sent emissaries to the emperor of Japan at the time, who the chronicles indicate was Qin Mi. And so part of this this mission, really emissary, was to establish kind of formal ties between the two kingdoms, as well as trade. But because of a common practice within Buddhist cultures, was that a lot of times emissaries were also missionaries. We saw that with Ashoka famously when we talked about Buddhism, of how Buddhism spread outside of India into the rest of Asia. It did it through diplomatic channels, but these diplomats would operate as missionaries for the religion. The same seems to be the case here in the Chronicles, that not only do they present kind of trade negotiations, but the story goes that they also included images of the Buddha as gifts and various Buddhist scriptures as gifts to the Emperor of Japan. This, as I kind of indicated, this event is kind of the official introduction of Buddhism to Japan, and that's how the chronicles presented. That's how the traditional stories and histories of Japan present it as well. But the story goes on. Inside the chronicle, it mentions that after receiving the Buddhist gift, that the Japanese emperor asked his top advisors if the Buddha should be worshipped in Japan. They were concerned that, of course, they had their own religions, they had their own deities, and so there was concern expressed by the emperor and expressed by this kind of council that the commies might get upset, that this would be a grave insult to the kami, and that therefore this would be more harm than good in concerning establishing relationships with the kingdom of Baekje there in modern South Korea. So the story goes is that this issue really divided the court between two camps, and there was two prominent leaders that were in them. There was the non-Buddhist and there was the pro-Buddhist camp. And the pro-Buddhist camp was led by an individual within the royal court who is named Soga non Inami, who supported the idea of accepting the Buddhists and Buddhist gifts and Buddhism as a valuable and worthy form of religion in their culture. However, the rest said no. We think it would be a grave danger. So the emperor in his wisdom, according to the chronicles, the emperor only allowed the Soga clan, Sogi no Inami and his family, only allowed the Sogana or Soga clan to worship the Buddha, in a sense, to kind of test it out. That if it goes bad, well, it's going to be Soga's fault. His clan's going to be quickly removed from the royal courts. They're going to be forced into exile. No harm, no foul. It can be easily fixed if the commies do get upset. And so this was typically accepted by the royal court to an extent. So the Chronicles says that it initially was accepted by the court, but however, pretty quickly the court um, became concerned. They became concerned that the Soga clan started to grow in influence, and it was really, you could tell from the Chronicle, it was really a technique, a ploy by not only uh, the Korean government, in a sense, the Korean kingdoms and the Korean people, who are using Buddhism to influence the royal court in order to have gain favor and influence, but also the chronicles seem to indicate mainland China as well. And so the Soga clan grew in influence because of their relationships to Korea and to the mainland of China. And thus Buddhism grew and grew. Eventually, the chronicles state that an outright war ensued. And that was between the Soga clan and some other predominant clans in Japan. But however, the Soga clan emerged victorious and grew in greater and greater stature through this civil war, and eventually had, if I remember right from my Japanese history, even had gained to be the superior element, the superior political element in the royal court of Japan. And either that they were the top advisors, they became shortly after the top advisors to the emperor, or that they had indeed, through family lineage, replaced the emperor, and that the Soga clan became the new emperorship. Again, I'm kind of fuzzy on that. I think I remember reading it and studying it in school. However, I just want to give that with caution. Overall, the point I want to make is that the Soga clan gained an influence, and because of that influence and became victorious following the Civil War, they began to promote Buddhism really uninterrupted. And so this is how Buddhism established over time. The reason that I brought this up is that over time, the Japanese needed to be able to distinguish themselves and their ancient practices with that of Buddhism. And so, thus, the term Shinto was used by the Japanese themselves in order to distinguish between the ancient and native practices and customs of the Japanese people prior to the advent of Buddhism to that of Buddhism that was arriving onto their shores, as well as later other elements of Chinese and Korean practices and traditions that began to start migrating to Japan at this time. And so we start seeing in the writings of the historians and the historical writings of the Japanese people that Shinto becomes now somewhat of a distinctive term used to denote the religious traditions of the Japanese people prior to Buddhism, or elements of Japanese cultures and traditions that are not Buddhist, that are not Confucius, that are not Taoism, that are not Korean shamanism, that would later come in as well, but very briefly. And so this was the case, and that Shinto as a distinctive religious tradition, however, really doesn't become solidified by the Japanese people until the Edo period of Japanese history. So the Edo period is from 1603 until 1867. So very late in its history, but Shinto kind of is there and exists, but it doesn't really become solidified as a guaranteed religious practice until much later. And we'll talk about that reason as well. As previously indicated in this lecture, Shinto has no recorded founder or recorded mythology concerning the origins of its religion. There's no prophet. There is no divine being coming to earth and then thus giving the religion, this new religion, to the people. There's no prophet who receives a divine message. There's nothing like that within our origins and knowledge of Shinto. In this sense, our nearest comparison of world religion would be that the origins of Hinduism. That if we remember, Hinduism had no founder or had no discernible origin except for theory. And we talked about the theory that the most prominent theory of the advent of Hinduism and what we think of Hinduism on the Indian subcontinent is that of the Aryan invasion theory or the modified Aryan migration theory for Hinduism. But again, we have no clear, distinct origin story. We have no clear, distinct, identifiable founder of the religion of Hinduism. Shinto is very much in that same vein. And so the origins of Shinto are very obscure. And there really is no single agreed upon theory as to how it developed. However, for our purposes here on this portion of the lecture, there are a number of theories that have been proposed in which that I want to discuss right now. So the first one is the kind of the hunter-gatherer cultural theory, or is better known as the Joimon theory of Japanese and Shinto history and culture. Basically, this theory argues that the origins of Shinto and the indigenous religion of the ancient Japanese people emerged during the Joimon period of Japanese history. So that's anywhere from 5000 BCE to 500 BCE. And so that the origins of this religion emerged from within this time period as well as within this culture that was a hunter gatherer. So we really don't know much about this period of Japan's history because I mean there's no written text, there's only artifacts and archaeological, but because of the nature and context of the island of Japan, our archaeological evidence is quite small and the research from this period is quite limited. However, what we do know is that this period was a transitional period, that we have a very diverse hunter gatherer society that over time would transition into a more independent, civilized, various city states that made up the bulk of the Japanese nation at this time, similarly as the ancient Greeks, similarly as the ancient Babylonians, to some extent the Egyptians as well, before they became unified within their kingdoms. And so it's believed that this hunter-gatherer society, because again, there's a lot of parallels with Shinto beliefs, classic Shinto beliefs, with that of the Native Americans, that of the Aborigines people, that of the First Nationers in Canada, or to some extent um, the West African religions, that there are some similarities here. So very primitive cultures, hunter-gatherer type cultures, and so there's some similarities, and this was why this theory emerged. So these hunter-gatherer societies, a common thread among all of them is the belief in these spirits of the natural world that could and had inhabited animals, that they inhabited trees, that they inhabited rivers and mountains. And that's what we exactly see within Shinto itself. So it leads this theory. So this theory kind of goes back to E.B. Tyler's theory that religion evolved originally from primitive cultures and primitive belief systems that emerged out of animism. Shinto is a belief system of animism still to this day, but it has morphed into anthropomorphic, which is just a fancy word, anthropomorphic for like human. These anthropomorphic deities that the commies become personified individuals later on and act like humans. But at the beginning, their culture was based off this hunter gatherer society. So, this primitive culture, like that of the Joimon period, were naturally inclined towards animism. And so, this is the most dominant theory out there, that it emerged from the indigenous hunter gatherer culture of Japan. The second theory is known as the Yayoi theory, or the migration from the mainland theory. This theory argues that the origins of Shinto were not so much the results of indigenous populations that naturally grew up with their religion and their religion naturally evolved, but rather that is the result of the culture surrounding the Yayoi period of Japanese history. So from 500 BCE until 300 CE. So again, the next period culture of Japan, meaning that this theory holds that it came a little bit later. It is believed that the Yayoi people, who were traditionally believed to be mainland Asian migrants who had migrated to Japan, primarily from the Korean Peninsula, but also possibly had migrated from the Yangtze River Delta region in mainland China, and that they had crossed the ocean, crossed the Sea of Japan to Japan and settled down. The reason for this, the reason for this belief is not only because we see eventually, even with the Japanese chronicles of trade and the later adoptions of Japanese and Korean cultures, that there's this start. There has to be a start for this, an impetus for this. And so this is one reason for that belief, is because the chronicles mention it as it is starting. And so therefore it must have already had a predate period. But the main evidence that these scholars who favor this theory cite similarities, especially between Shinto and the ancient religions that were found on the Korean Peninsula before the arrival of Buddhism. And Buddhism came to Korea prior to the 4th century CE, which fits this time period of the Yayoi people. And so, what we do know from archaeology and from Japanese historians is that the Yayoi people brought with them rice cultivation. They brought with them improved carpentry, improved architecture structures. They brought with them the art of metallurgy, making, crafting alloys and things like that, of building weapons and stronger weapons of iron, as well, copper, bronze. Well, bronze, sorry, not copper, but bronze. This is metallurgy here. So that the Yayoi people brought these techniques with them. They also brought with them a hierarchical social class structure, and even the roots of the Japanese language itself they brought with them. So this theory is linked to that we've already discussed prior to. So back to our first couple of lectures, we saw, the first one, the Joimon theory, sounds very similar to what E.B. Tyler advertised and argued concerning animism and the natural evolution of religion. This theory kind of sounds similar to what Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, argued concerning the source of religion, that the source of religion was high, especially for the Greeks in his mind, that it had to come from higher level societies and civilizations. And so Herodotus famously theorized that it was actually the ancient Egyptians who brought the Greeks their religions, because the ancient Egyptians were a much advanced and older society than that of the ancient Greeks. And so you're seeing a similar element here, that what the Yayoi people brought to Japan was a higher level of civilization. And so, because of that, it's often thought among religious scholars that higher levels of civilization produces higher levels of religious ideology as well. And so, this is very similar. If we wanted to say another religion that has a similar pattern, this is very similar to what we see with Hinduism, with the Aryan people, this theorized people that came from Central Asia, came from modern day, the high plains of Iran, Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, those areas of Central Asia. That these Aryan cultures migrated further south, either due because of climate change, because of opportunity. We're really not sure, but we saw what they brought with them was a culture that was reflected in the Vedas and their scriptures. And so we sort of see that here as well, that we see with the Yayoi people coming to Japan, that they brought with them a culture that fits Japanese culture and what we know of Japanese culture later on. And so, if Shinto is synonymous with ancient Japanese culture, then it's theorized that the Yayoi people brought Shinto with them. And again, because we see strong similarities with the ancient Korean religions, shamanism, um, we see strong parallels between it and Shinto. So, is these migrants who brought with them their own religious beliefs, which were based on the worship of natural spirits, and that these beliefs eventually merged into with existing beliefs of the Japanese people, and became what we would classify as Shinto. And so, this is probably the other most predominant theory. This is the theory that I myself hold on to as well, because it makes sense. And so, this is what I hold, and like I said, other significant minority of scholars hold concerning Shinto. The last theory that I wanted to mention is something that's kind of emerged in the last 30 years. Well, actually, the last 40 years of history, and in the context of Japanese history and Japanese scholarship. It's known as the Kuroda theory, or the basically much later creation of the state theory. And so this theory is attributed to the Japanese historian and scholar Toshi Kuroda in 1981, who wrote a paper in which he argued in his academic paper that Shinto, as an independent religion and a distinct religion, was born only in the modern period of Japan, was only conceived of and invented and emerged in the Meiji era of Japanese culture, and that it was an invention of Japanese nationalistic ideology. So, according to Kuroda, many features of Shinto are in fact typical characteristics, tropes, and ideologies that are found in Taoism, and that the name of Shinto has Chinese roots. And Kira argues that Chinese history saw the ancient religion of the Japanese people as something being very similar to themselves. And so that the what we would consider as the roots of Shinto were in fact actually Chinese elements, and that Shinto doesn't exist as a distinct Japanese culture until, in his argument, until the Meiji Restoration starting in 1868, in the 1870s, and that the activities of Shinto becomes formalized into a clear and distinct religious entity, and it was done by the state. that it really didn't exist prior to, that these were, again, elements in his mind of Chinese culture, of East Asian cultures that had migrated, because, like Buddhism and why Shinto practices that we'll discuss later get easily merged into Buddhism, because they were Chinese religions and Chinese cultures, and the Japanese people were more acceptant to that at the time. But according to Kuroda, um, it was the imperial state who codifies Shinto practices, who codifies Shinto religion rituals, who codifies Shinto institutions. It is this imperial state who segregates Japanese religion from Buddhism and Shinto. And it was the imperial state that used ancient Japanese mythologies to support and reinforce loyalty to the imperial state, as well as to legitimize the restoration efforts of the Meiji period. And so that is really his argument, is that it's a much later invention. And so this is a very much a minority view, but is a view that has gained prominence in the recent history with the reevaluation of classifications and definitions of religion. Um, as I say, many scholars do not recognize this theory. However, they do recognize that the activities of the Meiji period does produce a new form of Shinto, that scholars and historians call state Shinto. And we'll talk about state Shinto at the end of our lecture. But very quickly, following the defeat of Japan, during World War II, state Shinto was largely disbanded as the new government sought to promote religious freedoms of its civilizations in line with Western values. And so Shinto has entered this new period of amalgamation. That does it exist, does it not exist anymore? And so this is where Kuroda's theory kind of falls on its face, because even though the state ends, Shinto practices continue. So it must have had a pre-existent prior to the state. Um, but regardless of whatever theory an individual holds, and whatever theory that you find more convincing with your study of Shinto, the reality is that Shinto appears, and I think this is this is where I would hang my hat on, or the hill that I'd be worth dying upon, in its essence, that regardless of what theory an individual holds, Shinto appeared as a religious and distinct entity by the Yamato period in Japan. So the period between 250 to 710 CE, that we do see Shinto as a distinct, in my belief, as a distinct religious entity. And so, regardless of how it began, we know when it becomes a recognizable and self-sufficient and independent religion. And it's really during this period of time. And so that will lead us to our next topic. As stated in the introduction to the lecture, Shinto is a polytheistic, animistic, and syncretistic indigenous religion of Japan that revolves around the belief in supernatural entities called kami. And while we have already discussed the qualifiers of Shinto, that is, it is polytheistic, animistic, syncretistic to an extent. We'll discuss that more here later. What we need to discuss right now is what are kami. So, first off, kami are deities, spirits, mythological or natural phenomenons, and or holy powers that are venerated in the Shinto religion. Kami are the central object of worship for the Shinto belief. They can be elements of the landscape. They can be forces of nature or supernatural forces for either good or bad. Um, beings that are they can be beings and they can be qualities of beings, or let me rephrase that, qualities of expression. So jealousy, anger, love, greed, things like that. Or they can just simply be spirits of the venerated dead, so like your ancestors. And many kami are considered the ancient ancestors of entire family clans, and traditionally, the great leaders of Japan, like the emperor, could be or could become a kami upon their death, or they could just be a kami from birth. It is also important to note that the word here, kami in Japanese, is both singular and plural. So there's no such thing as kamis, there's just kami. And because of this feature within Japanese language, it is sometimes unclear whether a kami refers to a singular entity, or whether that singular entity represents multiple entities within itself, or if a kami is not a singularity, but rather a collective of multitudes of entities. So it's really unclear from history and from Japanese mythology, if again one particular kami is a singular entity, or if it's a refers to a collection of entities. And as far as etymology is concerned, um, the word kami in Japanese just generally means and is generally translated as spirit, but it can be used to talk about a divine being like gods or a supreme singular deity, or it can be used to describe the soul of a person or their consciousness of a person. So it does have a wide range of use inside the Japanese culture and language, but generally when you see it, it's mostly talking about spirit, either the spirits of the underworld, the spirits of the supernatural world, or your spirit, your soul. As we've already discussed, while Shinto has no founder, no overarching doctrine, no religious texts that are central to its faith, there are a few books that we do look at from scholarship, and that even Shinto scholars kind of considered canonical. And so, for our purposes here, we're going to be looking at primarily information from two of the most ancient texts within Japanese culture to help us understand some of the characteristics and makeup of a kami. And so, the religious text, or the historical text, the ancient text of the Kojiki, which is a translation, which translates into English as basically an account, a retelling, a story. But largely when it's translated into English, it's an account of ancient matters or ancient mythologies, ancient sources. And so this textbook was written around 712 CE by scholar, according to scholar internal evidences, and it primarily contains their ancient mythologies. So this is going to be one text that we're going to use to unpack what a kami is. The other text is the Nihon Soki, which we've already talked about as well, which is the Chronicles of Japan, and it was written around 720 CE, and it contains the earliest records of Japanese history, as well as some, because of that early record keeping, some of these records or accounts are really mythology stories. So we have some mythology stories within this ancient text that also elucidate what a kami is. And so within these traditions, that we come away with really five defining characteristics of a kami. that are clearly identifiable within these texts and that educate us as to how kami were seen and how they were venerated in Shinto. And so these are five characteristics of a kami. The first characteristic is that a kami possesses two souls or two minds. Traditionally, kamis possess two souls or two minds, meaning that one of these souls or one of these minds was classified within Japanese culture as Niji Matami, which means like a gentle spirit. Or sometimes you'll see the phrase Saki Matami, which is like a happy spirit, a jovial spirit. So there's one half of the coin of a kami that is gentle, kind, loving, benevolence, happy, jovial, but they have the opposite side. The other side is ara matia, which is like assertive. Or you'll see words like kushi mitamaya, which is like mysterious. And so what they're talking about is that the kamis are similar to Taoism, that they are of two minds, that they are um, have two characteristics about them. They can be benevolent in one instance, and in the immediate instance, they can be quite beguiling. They can be quite harsh. They can be quite demanding versus being at the next moment understanding. So these companies can be can nurture and can love when they are respected, or they can cause destruction and disharmony when they are not being disrespected. So it's very similar to what we see with the ancient gods of the Greeks, or even of the ancient Hindu gods of the old Vedic religions, or when we think of the ancient Egyptians and stuff like that. Appeasement. That if you appease the gods, they will always be on your side. But however, the gods can be. I'm trying to think of a better word to say than they can be cruel. That's I know a popular phrase from when in Greek sources that the gods could bless you in the morning and then curse you in the evening. It's the will of the gods. That same ideology is also in place here with Shinto. And so this is where we can see some parallelism, some comparative studies if we look at it. Within Shinto, a kami must be appeased in order to gain their favor and to avoid their wrath. So again, very similar to what we always have underceived and perceived about the ancient gods of the ancient world. Second is that kamis are um, uh, not visible to the eyes of humans. That they're not even visible for the physical manifestation world. They don't have a physical form. While a kami exists in the physical world, they cannot be seen. Instead, they inhabit a sacred space. They manifest themselves in natural phenomenons or temporarily reside inside people during rituals that ask for their blessings. Kami are believed to be hidden from this world and that they inhabit a contemplatory existence along the physical plane, and that their existence mirrors our existence in the world. And so, this mirroring aspect is known as the Shinkai, or is referred to the spiritual world, the world of the kami, and where they reside. And so that they exist in another dimension or another ethereal plane, the spirit world, if we wanted to talk about it like that. Third is that kami are limited to they're not limited, let me rephrase that, they're not limited to a singular or to a physical location, that in fact Japanese believe the kami consistently move about. They're consistently moving around. They can temporarily reside at a place, but they are on the move constantly. So within Japanese culture, the kami are a mobile spirit. They're a spirit on the move. They can always be on the move, visiting the various places in which they are worshipped, of which there can be several of these places within Japan that are dedicated to either one specific kami or to several different specific kamis, because again, they believe that they're always on the move and that kamis never stay in the same place forever. Again, they're always on the move. So while they may be stationary at a shrine to a specific kami, or they could be affixed to a natural location like trees, mountains, lakes, rivers in Japan, in which a practitioner goes to in order to venerate the kami is not geographically locked into a singular location. They don't reside, their powers are not limited to a physical location. So within ancient cultures, some ancient cultures did believe that the gods indeed were restricted to certain regions, certain facilities, certain places. Like, for example, Poseidon, that in ancient Greek mythology, Poseidon's strength comes from the sea. And so, if you're stuck in land deep within the mountains, you're really not praying to Poseidon because there's no need. There's no need for his favoritism. There's no need to avoid his wrath. But however, once you get closer to the ocean, once you get ready to jump on a boat and sail across the Mediterranean or the Aegean Sea in ancient Greece, you immediately started to sacrifice to Poseidon in order to gain his favor, to ensure that you have good, safe weather when you're traveling upon the ocean. Back then, they didn't have weather apps to know if this is really a good time to travel, or no, there's about to be a hurricane on the horizon. We shouldn't be heading that direction. They didn't know those things. And so this is why they did sacrifices. But again, if you're high up on a mountain, if you're deep, deep within a desert, deep, deep within the continent of Europe or Asia, you're rarely going to pray, if not at all, pray to Poseidon. You're going to be praying to somebody else who's more geographically centered to your needs. That doesn't really exist in the realm of Shinto and Kami, because again, a Kami is not limited to a physical location. Their spirit is consistently on the move. So even if, like, for example, um, let me think of a Kami here. Let's see. Amaterasu. Yeah, that's a good one. Amaterasu is the sun goddess, or the kami of the sun. The sun, you know, appears only during the day, doesn't really appear at night. That would be odd. But yet the spirit of Amaterasu is not limited to just the daytime. It can travel beyond being just the kami associated with the sun. So again, that's why Amaterasu is venerated beyond just the daytime within Japan, because that's why Amaterasu is also seen as part of the imperial family. So therefore, he's, or let me rephrase that, she is venerated quite often and frequently in Shinto cultures. So again, a kami is not limited to a singular location, physical locations. So if you ever go to Japan, very often, if you ever see a Shinto festival, Shinto festivals always, always, without a doubt, include mobile shrines of the kami, or always include mobile processions of priests because they believe that the kammis are on the move, and so they will travel from one shrine to another in order to venerate the kami. Number four, another characteristic is that there are many different varieties of the kami that we learn. In the Kojiki, they list over 300 different classifications of kami, and then they all have different functionalities, such as the kami of wind or a kami of entryways, a kami of the road or the path. So they have a myriad of functionalities within the Shinto system, similar to like we experienced with ancient Greek societies or just the ancient religions of the Mediterranean world. Or Native Americans, that you might have a variety of polytheistic deities that they have these strong associations. And within Shinto myths, they speak of even many more kamis than just 300 that are listed. They can be expressed in an infinite number of potentialities as Japanese culture evolves and becomes more aware of the universe, and human behaviors evolve as well. Kami, the uncovering of various new kamis emerge within their cultures, or if they're exposed to other cultures as well, that some of that, like for example, Buddhism, some of its elements became associated with Shinto, and so they adopted many of Buddhism's ideologies concerning the Bodhisattvas, that they grabbed them and saw them as kami as well. And so there's no limit as to how many kami can exist or do exist at one time. The latest count is around 900 that have been self-identified, but then at the same time, there is a specific classification of kami, which basically in English means infinite, limitless, countless is the better word there. And the last characteristic of a kami is that all kami have different duties or guardianship to people around them. Just as people have an obligation to keep the kami happy, the kami have to perform the specific functionalities of the object, places, or ideas that they inhabit. So if they inhabit a tree, the kami has the functionality of helping that tree grow, helping that tree produce fruit, helping that tree to blossom, to grow leaves, and to provide shade, to provide oxygen as well. Those functionalities also get subsumed onto the kami. A river flows, provides nutrients, provides life for fishes and stuff like that. The kami do these things as well. If they inhabit the sun, again, the duty of the sun is to rise every morning, to provide light, and to warm the ground and the earth, and to set in the evening, and to provide coolness and rest for individuals. And so the Japanese see these acts of nature as characteristics of the kami, but they also see it as a functionality, just as we as humans have duties and functions within our society, whether or within our family units. Gamis do as well. If they are ancestors, if they are inhabit our ancestors, they are responsible for providing guidance to the next generation as to how they continue to honor their clans, their families' legacy, and the reputation, and welcoming other newly deceased relatives who pass away into death. So again, they have functionalities. Thus, in a real sense, the kami has a social responsibilities to humanity, just as humanity has a social responsibility to the kami. So you have this reciprocal relationship within Shinto that must be active and conscious in order to have true harmony within Japanese society. Because again, if everybody's doing their job, society functions. And it's the same principle that we have today. That if we have, um, you know, something like garbage men, people who pick up our trash, during the week. Imagine if they weren't doing that. Trash would build up pretty quickly. Our society would not be so great. We'd be much angrier because of a smelly atmosphere of having a dirty city. So everybody has to do their job, and that involves you too, of collecting your trash, putting it out into receptacles for pickup, putting trash that you have and consume in garbage cans in the city or in parks, things like that. So you can see a reciprocal actions. You have a duty just as the trash man has a duty. And then when everybody's working in harmony, everything is pretty grand. Society's much happier. Your park is a much better place to go and visit. Your city's a much better place to walk around and stroll. Your neighborhood is much better if everybody's doing their job. And so it's that same concept of being applied to kami and to the future. Um, in Shinto, in addition, kamis are not separate from nature, but they are of nature, possessing positive and negative aspects, possessing good and evil characteristics. So, in this sense, Shinto is often described as a pantheistic religion. So, we haven't really talked about pantheistic religions. I think we might have when we discuss Hinduism, because sometimes Hinduism gets falsely accused of being as a pantheistic religion, but that's not the case. Shinto is truly a pantheistic religion. And so, what does pantheism mean? Well, for this term, it means the belief that the universe is God and that God is the universe. In other words, pantheism sees no distinction between God and the natural world. The earth is God, the universe is God. And so that's something that is of significance and profound difference than we have with Hinduism, that was a pantheist, pantheist, which is Pantheism, pantheism. That instead was, instead of the universe being God, is that all things are God. So there's some differences there. And very quickly, the last thing that I want to mention about kami here is that in Shinto, um, kami are also considered manifestations of a religious concept known as mushubi, and are considered exemplaries of what humanity should strive towards. So these are examples of things to follow. Similar to, I guess, within Christianity, you would say a saint, as somebody that is within Catholicism, somebody that is admired and venerated, who's studied, because this is an example for us to follow. Or in Islam, the Prophet Muhammad is often seen as the best exemplary of what a Muslim is to be, and so that's why the Prophet is um, venerated in a sense, but rather studied, respected, honored. Um, the life of the Prophet is gravely studied and contemplated upon, because for Muslims, that is a source of exemplarism to follow and to behave. How did the Prophet do it? It's similar here within Shinto, but it's the kami that hold this characteristic. So what is Mushubi? Mushubi is a religious concept that refers to the creative and life-giving power of the universe. Similar to in Taoism, the Tao is seen as this life-giving creative power that moves and is within everything. Similar concept here within Shinto of Mushubi. And so that it's this force that brings together everything and that creates new life. And so the kami is synonymous with uh, Mushubi. And so it's through the kami that creation emerges, or that the creation of Japan had occurred. Mushubi is also believed to be the force that connects people to each other and connects people to the natural world. So it's again associated with relationship, it's associated with community, it's associated with harmony, similar to the Tao. And we'll talk about why kami are considered exemplaries that humanity should strive for in a moment. But the last bit of information that I want to talk to about with concerning a kami is their taxonomy. And so within Shinto, there are really three main uh, demographies, or here, excuse me, I had to sneeze for a minute. Sorry. Um, Three classifications, three categorizations of economy, these taxonomies of economy. And so I wanted to break them down here very briefly for you. That there is the Amatsukami, these are the heavenly deities. There's the Kunitsukami, these are the spirits of the earthly realm, those that inhabit the earth and perform certain functionalities within the earth. And then there's also the countless kamis, the infinite ones, this kind of new all encompassing classification that has emerged. But really, I'm going to focus on the first two of them. So for the Amatsukami, they're grouped. They're a group of kami believed to have been the original kami or gods of the Japanese mythology. They are said to have descended from the heavenly plane in Shinto, which the heavenly plane is known as Takamagara. The Amatsukami are often divided into three subgroups. And so uh, within this subgroup, you would have the Koto Atsumaki, and these are the original gods of creation. The phrase means the distinguished ones of heaven, or the distinguished heavenly kami, and they're very important within this subgroup, and they're said to be really the original gods of creation. Within the Koto Amatsukami, you have certain Shinto kamis like Amin no Minkanu Su, who is the or not Su, she, sorry, Amin no Min Kanu Shi, who is the supreme kami of all of Shinto. If you had to have a kind of, I guess, Zeus-like figure, it would be Amin Namen Kanu Nushi. You also have Takamen Sushubi, he's the creator kami, the kami of growth, of development. And then you have Kami Musub, who is the kami of fertility and abundance. And so all three of these deities were able to create life in general, because all you could see, all of their characteristics involve the act of creation. Then there is another subcategory, and these are probably the more predominant ones, the more famous ones within Japanese culture, and these are known as the three noble children, and are said to be the children of Amin Noman. I always say this name's wrong because it's hard. Amin Nomen An Sushi. And so the three children that you have are the sun goddess, the ancestry kami of the Japanese imperial family. You have her consort, her husband, within the Japanese mythology, the god of the moon and night, Su Kuyomi, and you have Susano, the god of the storms and the seas. So it's very important to note here that within most polytheistic religions, the deity of the moon is usually overwhelmingly feminine, while the deity of the sun is overwhelmingly masculine. So if you think of Greek cultures and Greek mythology, think of Apollos and Artemis. Apollos is the god of the sun. Artemis is the goddess of the moon. In Egyptian mythology, Ra, the god of the sun, and Isis, the goddess of the moon. But here in Japanese mythology, which is very interesting, the roles are reversed. So that's just something important to note here that the gender here is reversed. So there is significance to this, but this is not the place to talk about it. And then there's also a third categorization within this subgroup of the heavenly deities. And it really is this third subcategory is really just one individual known as Kunito Koto Tachi, who is the kami of the whole earth. Um, and then the next category that we have is the Kunisukami. They're a group of kami believed to have been the original, to have originated here on Earth after creation. The Kunitsukami are associated with Earth, with nature, and with the human realm. And some of the most important of these subgroups are the brother and sister couple of Inzagni and Izanami. These two are the creator god and goddesses of the nation, the island nation of Japan, and are often seen as the archetypical family, despite the fact that they are brothers and sisters. Then there's also Suratako no Kami, which is the god of the road and of greetings. And Who's very important because, again, that's why in Japanese culture, uh, uh, foreigners or people who are traveling on a journey are welcomed into people's homes because it is recognized as you, in some instance, are either a manifestation of this kami. And so, greeting people, always being kind. Japanese always seem to be very polite, is because these moments they believe are manifestations of the kami. I didn't have it listed here on the slide here, but there's another important kami within this subgroup. Futotama is the kami of rice and agriculture, and so rice is a very much a staple diet of East Asian cultures, and so this is another kami that is of great significance. And then there's also these countless kamis, the ones that are emerging all the time in various spirits. Some of these kamis are unnamed as well. So this is just kind of the infinite realm of kami. And any future kami that we didn't include, that we have encountered here recently from Japan's exposure to other cultures, get placed into this third subgroup. But before I transition into our next slide, I really quickly wanted to give a little bit of some of the mythology behind how the world was created within Shinto beliefs. So, according to the Koji Ki, the universe was immersed in a beaten and shapeless kind of matter that in Japanese they would refer to as chaos. And that at the beginning of the universe, there was just nothing but silence. But the universe began to take shape through two things, which is very interesting in comparison to other mythologies. It wasn't so much the kamis were created that created these things, but rather an unknown source created things. And within Japanese mythology, it was sound and light. Through the combination of sound and light, creation emerged. So some people, a lot of religious scholars and even scientists would say, is this the Big Bang? Did the Japanese mythology, thousands and thousands of years ago, have a mythology that includes the Big Bang? Sound and light. That sounds like an explosion. And that's how it's described. An explosion had emerged, and that light was able to rise up from above chaos, from all other matters, forming first clouds, and then being able to form the heavens. Sounds like a bomb going off too. If you think about the atomic bomb being, burst and images you think of it. What do you see? A bright light and then clouds rising from above the ground and above chaos, bright light. So yeah, it's very interesting. Um, and so light was able and the sound was able to create this heavenly realm known as Tagamagara. And Tagamagara is the abode of the heavenly gods and is often depicted as this location above the sky, and is believed to be connected to Earth through a kind of floating bridge, the rainbow. And so you can see the elements of Norse mythology here too, of how the earth is connected, the physical realm is connected to the spiritual realm through a rainbow, the rainbow called Ami no Yukihashi. In the Kojik, the heavenly realm is described as a place of great beauty, of perfection, a place that's made of pure gold, and that the ground is made of jade, white jade, and that the trees are made of coral reefs. And the gods of the heavenly realm are to be immortal and are perfect, and that they live in perfect peace and harmony. Uh, the rest of the particles that light rose and created these other universes, the rest of the particles had fell onto the ground or had not risen at all, and instead that they lumped together and formed huge dense masses in darkness, and this area is called the earth. And so once the heavens and the earth came into existence within Japanese mythology, we see the kami emerge. And so this is kind of similar to Hindu theology of the old Vedics, is that the gods were created. It seems like within Japanese mythologies, the kami were created as well, but we don't know by who. The texts are It's by nature itself that they emerge out of nature just as humans did. So evolution seems to be the explanation here of this mythology. So Japanese cultures had possibly an idea of the Big Bang, an idea of evolution prior to the scientific revolution in our modern times. And so after receiving a command from other kami to solidify and shape the earth, the divine couple within Shinto of Izagni and Izanami went about their work to create Japan. And so the myth goes, and this famous image here is part of the mythology, is that the couple dipped a jeweled spear that they had into um, um, the water below from the clouds, and dipped it into the spear, and the spear into the water, and kind of churned the water. And then when they pulled the spear from the water, perfect drops fell from the spear itself. And when the drops landed into the water, that they formed the mythical island in which the earthly kamis live on, known as Onogoro. Then the divine couple then proceeds to live in this mythical island and to continue their act of creation. And so Exagni and Izami devised that they devised a ritual that they would do in order to create. And basically, the ritual was marriage, a marriage ceremony. Where and the marriage ceremony seems very interesting and odd, but that's what they're doing in the mythical text. Is this is the origins of myths of marriages, and that marriages come from the gods. So you can see here that why this divine couple is kind of seen as a prototype of coupling, or the archetypal couple of a family. And so, how does a family create? It creates through marriage. The ritual involved the divine couple walking in opposite directions from each other around a pillar. And that after they walked around this pillar and meet up again, they would greet each other, and then they would initiate intercourse in order to procreate. But it's interesting here, the mythology goes that when they first attempted it, um, that when they both, Exagni and Ignami, walked in opposite directions from around the pillar and walked towards each other and met each other on the other side of the pillar, it was supposed to be Inzagni that was supposed to speak as the man, but instead it was Inzanami, the female, that she greeted Inzagni first. And this made him very mad. He objected that as the man, he should have been the first one to speak, and that he should have been given preference too. But however, they still got it on. Um, you can't stay angry forever, and so they had intercourse, and the product of their first intercourse, their first union, produced an offspring that was known in Japanese mythology as Hiroko, who was considered an imperfect being after he was born. He was born without bones. And the reason that the Japanese myths give this is because directly of Inzagnami's transgression, that she spoke first. And so they gave birth to this boneless child. And because Hiroko had no bones, and was unable to stand or even exist on this mythical land or on land at all, what the divine couple did was decided to um, create a boat of reeds and set the child out on the sea to live and reside in the sea. And so Hiroko would go on to be the kami of the fish, and is to believe that Hiroko is the source of the pufferfish or the source of the jellyfish. And so that's why he doesn't have any bones, is because he's a fish. So he becomes the father of fish in this sense. The mythology goes, is that the couple then repeated the ritual, but they did it correctly this time. The marriage ritual, that they went around the pillar, and that when they met each other, Inzagni greeted Ignami first, and that then they had sex, and that their union was successful, giving birth to the islands of Japan. And so that is the mythology, the story that we have of the creation of Japan, and that the couple would continue this ritual, and that they would beget various other kamis that would go into inhabit the land of Japan, and thus those kamis would then begin to create the rest of Japan.
So, what do followers of Shinto believe? Shinto does not have traditional doctrines or teachings concerning eschatology. And if you recall, eschatology is the belief about the end of the world, or belief about last things, quite literally. And so Shinto, because of this, Shinto's not focused on the afterlife really at all. Its main focus, what it teaches, what it really, the practices kind of really emphasize, is on living this life. In Shinto, they believe that the universe has been created and destroyed many times in the past, similarly to ideas that we already discussed with reincarnation, with Hinduism and Buddhism to an extent. that the universe has been created and destroyed multiple times, and that they'll continue to be this cycle of creation and destroyed in the future. So thus, there's not really an emphasis on having a belief in the afterlife. This cycle of creation and destruction is seen as really a part of the natural world. And this is where we believe that Shinto gets its influences from, not so much Buddhism and when it emerged and came over to Japan, but rather just natural religion, what we would call, or natural philosophy. Life cycles. Look at a flower, look at a tree. It blooms, it dies. It recycles every year. When the winter time, all the leaves go off. The tree loses its leaves, but when spring comes, it reblossoms. The leaves come back, and they turn from green colored leaves. The tree looks full of life, and then the cycle repeats. Thus, within Shinto, that order continues, even into our lives, into the natural world. That if it happens among trees, it happens among humans, and thus it happens in the universe. So Shinto is more focused on living a good life in the present moment, as there really is no eternal reward punishment modeled within this religion, like we will see with the Eastern or with the Western religions. However, it is important to note that there is elements of an internal reward punishment model within Shinto. So there are some. Kami are believed to be present in the human soul. And when a person dies, their kami is said to have returned to the realm of the kami. And it's suggested that there is this continuation of life after death, reincarnation in a sense, but a different mode. Well, let me rephrase that. Not so much reincarnation, but rather that an eternal existence, similar to how Christians and Muslims would believe that there is such a thing as eternal life. But there is no resurrection of the dead, of the body, like Christianity and Islam believes. Furthermore, the Kyoji records that in this realm of the dead, known as Yomi no Kuni, the realm of the dead, Shinto believes that dead relatives can become ancestral kami, so some kind of a reward system in this sense. So again, there suggests a continuation of life. So there is some kind of belief in an afterlife, but it's not what we would consider an afterlife within a Christian context or a Western religion context. Finally, Shinto's afterlife also includes the idea of the obiki. The obiki is this idea of a restless spirit who dies in very bad circumstances, and thus the spirit goes on and seeks revenge, for their death or for the circumstances of how their death was handled. Either it could be an improper burial ceremony. Their body was not taken care of as it's supposed to traditionally be, not given a traditional burial, things like that. And so then this does suggest, again, a continuation of life after death, but also some type of punishment in a sense. So it's very vague. It's there, but I wanted to mention it. However, there are also many other Shinto practitioners who do not really believe in an afterlife. They believe that the soul just simply exists and then cease to exist after death. But then again, there is the whole kami belief with ancestors, so that's why it's very complex, very convoluted. But I just wanted to mention that typically Shinto focuses on living your best life now. However, there are elements of an afterlife. Another key theme that I want to talk about within Shinto is that because of this focus on present life, one of the central tenets of the Shinto religion is the avoidance of kigari, meaning pollution. It sometimes also gets translated in English as impurity. So there's the avoidance of kirkagi as well as sumi, which is often translated as violation. But you could also see it being translated as sin. But I want to really avoid that definition because then again, it connotes a Western religion and Western ideologies upon this religion, which doesn't really exist. But like I said, you'll most times see it translated as sin, sumi. However, I'd rather you have it seen and understood as a violation, like a rule violation. You broke the rule. So again, there's this theme within Shinto of avoiding pollution, avoiding breaking the rules while ensuring that you have hari, which is purity. Sometimes often is translated as cleansingness, but for this context, purity. So in Shinto, kirkagi is not a moral concept. So thus, again, it's not seen as sin or seen as punishment in the context of a Western religion idea. Rather, it is seen as a natural force, a force that is natural within nature, but a force that can be harmful if it's not properly dealt with and handled. So examples of kirkagi, it can be a variety of things, like most things like having close contact with a dead person, dealing with diseases, illnesses, handling garbage or handling human or animal excrement. Childbirth is also seen as a pollution, an act of pollution, a natural event, but an act of pollution, as well as for women, menstruation, and for men, the discharging of semen, either in acts of intercourse or in what is known as wet dreams. These are all things that happen naturally to human life and that are part of nature. However, it is viewed as being seen as impure, religiously impure. These same contexts are also in display within Judaism. And so this is something that is parallel. So think of ritual impurities, but on a natural scale. Then you have sumi, which generally indicates a violation of social or legal rules. But in the realm of religion, sumi is a violation of what we would consider divine taboos by conscious acts of evil deeds. So you could say sin, but I really want to avoid that connotation here. In Shinto, sumi is as a state of defilement resulting from unnatural acts, which it really defines as criminal acts. So this can involve anything from lying, sexual immorality, committing violence against someone, vandalism, theft, are great prominent examples of what within Shinto would consider these violations of the divine taboo. Sumi within Shinto religion is thought to hinder the proper growth of an individual, of their life force as well, that starts to diminish as well. The last thing is that of hari, which is it's a general term for ritual purification in Shinto, and its purpose is to purify the pollutions out of your soul that corrupt your body or that is corrupting your soul, and it involves ritual washing primarily. With water, known as misogi. And so misogi is a very common tradition that you'll see in Japan. You'll see these edifices, these erected distribution centers of water, sort of like a trough, if you think for horses. But it's, or you might even think of it as like a well or a little small fountain. You might mistake it as, but no, these are important edifices within society. And so again, these buildings, these little shrines, these little places are where someone can perform a ritual washing within the Japanese culture. Washing is mostly with water, but however, within Shinto tradition, salt is also permitted. Salt is very valued commodity within Japanese culture. They take a lot of pride in making salt from the sea. There's rituals that you can go to and see how Japanese will make salt the old way from seawater and stuff like that. And so salt is recognizing as a purifying agent. Salt has always been used within culture to preserve meat and to preserve meat from decaying. And so that's the same principle with the soul. It's a cleansing agent. So you could rub your body down with salt. I don't know if I would want to do that, but you could. There's also the use of haragushi, which is basically this kind of wand that has white paper streamers that are attached to the very end of it, and that a person will wave over the person or over an object for the purpose of purifying them and cleansing them. This is something that needs to be done by a Shinto priest. Also, prayer is an important part of Shinto practices and rituals. And so prayers directed to the kami can help cleanse the soul from these natural impurities as well as unnatural impurities. So again, the whole purpose of the Shinto religion is to have a purified individual, ritually purified, because I guess if you want to use the old saying, cleanliness is next to godliness. Cleanliness of the soul, cleanliness of the body, cleanliness of your actions is next to godliness. So it's something very valued within the Japanese culture and within Shinto. And lastly, I also want to talk about while that there is no unified code of behavior within Shinto. There's no set of creed, there's no thou shalt nots, there's no 10 commandments or anything like that. Shinto does place great significance on morality, personal, individual morality, and personal and individual responsibility and behavior. And so Shinto has devised what is known as the Gosho, or the 5 virtues that every practitioner of Shinto is to actively have within their life. The first of the Gosho is that of sojiki, or sometimes also known, translated as honesty, being honest, telling the truth, having high integrity. Shojiki is seen as an essential within Shinto for living a good and moral life, as it is the foundation of everything that we do as society. Society is built on trust and respect. And the only way that you can have trust and respect in society is to be honest with people, to conduct yourself with a high level of integrity within individuals, within your own social group, and within society as a whole. So imagine if a salesperson wasn't honest. That's pretty easy for us to understand. We've all been duped by a clever salesman with a good product pitch. And then once you buy the product, it's just crap. But imagine that consistently, unhonestly. We don't value these people. We avoid the salesperson, the sales pitch. We avoid that because we have a low level of trust within them. Or imagine a world if politicians were honest. We all inherently look at politicians and all inherently know that they're not honest. They're corrupt. Even if you're a Democrat, if you're a Republican, even if you're voted for the president or totally against the president, you know deep down these people are not honest people. These people are not of high integrity because they're in politics. They just want votes. They just want to stay in power. So they'll say whatever they want to say that you want to hear in order for them to stay in power, because that's what they want. They want just the vote. But imagine if you had a politician who was honest. Imagine if you had a politician who was of high integrity. Everybody would vote for him, regardless if you're a Democrat or Republican. But that just doesn't exist. But just imagine how much of a better world that would be. This is the kind of context that Shinto is talking about. Why this is number one, the number one virtue, honesty and integrity. So what Shojiki does is that it asks individuals to be mindful of their words, to be mindful of their actions, and to always strive to be truthful and to be straightforward. I think all of us, regardless of whatever religious connotation that we hold dear, whether we're atheist or Muslim, Christian, Jew, or I just don't know, all of us could value this virtue within our lives and see value of it. The next virtue is jin. Jin, which is in Japanese means benevolence. Not so much charity, but all lovingness, kindness, but more important than kindness. In Shinto, benevolence is the virtue of showing compassion towards others. It's about being willing to help those in need and to treat others with respect and understanding. This is why a lot of people praise the Japanese culture, because of their insistence on benevolence. Japanese typically treat strangers with kindness. There might be some reservations, fear of dealing with a foreigner, dealing with someone who's a stranger, but typically Japanese will always lean towards kindness when they can. There's a great example of this. If you're a soccer fan, we recently had the Men's World Cup not too long ago. We're about to have the Women's World Cup in New Zealand, and always a highlight of any time that the Japanese team, the Japanese soccer team, is in these World Cups. Every single commentator will highlight the end of a game. The very end of the game. After the game is over, the cameras will stay around and look at the stands, because they'll see because they want to see what the Japanese people do, and the Japanese people do this all the time. They'll stay behind and they'll pull out trash bags from book bags that they carried, from purses that they carried inside the game. They'll pull out trash bags and start cleaning up the area around them. Like I said, again, you can Google this. You can look at YouTube videos of this. This is all every time during the World Cups, during a competition where the Japanese national teams play. Everybody will always focus on this aspect of the Japanese fans and the Japanese people. They'll clean up after the game is over. They'll clean up their area. They'll grab popcorns, grab drinks, grab soda bottles, put them in trash bags, and then take them to a recycle. And they leave their area spotless, absolutely spotless. And so again, like, commentators love this, absolutely love this. That spirit, that action comes from this. Jin, benevolence, compassion, thinking of others. So think about that. Think of, like I said, I encourage you to Google that when you can. Again, back to Jin and Shinto. Jin, or benevolence, is seen as a way of connecting oneself with the kami, with the divine spirits. Because for them, the kamis want to be benevolent. And so if you're benevolent, they're benevolent, and everything lives in harmony because you have these practices. Again, just imagine if you go to a football stadium and cleaning up after yourself. That would be amazing. The streets of your local city would be fantastically clean if everybody picked up their trash, if they thought of other people. The next is you. Why you? And it means courage. In Shinto, courage is defined as the virtue of facing one's fears and doing what is right even when it's difficult to do. It's about willing to stand up for what you believe in, even when it's unpopular. And courage is seen as a way, again, like benevolence, is seen as a way of connecting oneself with the kami and creating a more harmonious but peaceful world. Courage of doing the right thing, seeing a bully who's, berating someone smaller than them, standing up for a friend. When you're in trouble, where you've been caught doing something that you shouldn't be doing, owning up to it, being honest. Honesty takes courage. Integrity takes courage. Compassion takes courage. So, courage. The next is rei. Rei, which in Japanese usually gets translated as respect, but often it really means a courtesy. That's the better translation of what we would think of. So in Shinto, what rei is a virtue of showing deference and honoring others. It's about being mindful of other people's feelings and other people's needs and treating others with dignity and respect. We have this in Western religion and culture. We do this with our veterans. We treat our veterans with respect. If we see a veteran, if we're able to, talk with the veteran, we always say thank you for your service. We make sure that in the airports that they are the first to board a plane and the first to leave a plane. Sometimes at airports when veterans are coming back from service overseas, people will stop and start clapping and cheering them on. That's a sign of respect within our cultures. Think of that. Think of rei as that, this type of courtesy. So we all know this about the Japanese. The Japanese treat elders, their parents, with a lot of respect. Treat their bosses with a lot of respect. Treat people within their hierarchy, those higher than themselves, with a lot of respect. And so that is a virtue. And it takes courage to do this. It takes high integrity to do this. And you are showing acts of benevolence. So you can see within the Shinto, the 5 virtues of Shinto, that they build upon each other constantly. The last is chi, which is usually translated as discernment or having wisdom. In Shinto, wisdom is a virtue of using one's intelligence to make good decisions and to live a life that is harmonious with the natural world. It's about being able to see the big picture and to make decisions that are in the best interest of oneself, one's community, as well as the whole wide world. And so thus wisdom is seen again as a way to connect with the kami or asking for wisdom. And so these are the heart of Shinto culture. And the reason we have these virtues is because these virtues lead an individual to live their life according to the kanagara, which is the way of the kami. These 5 virtues are supposed to be what the kamis best represent. And this is what you as an individual is supposed to strive towards as well. But if you disrupt these 5 virtues, if you disrupt harmony within Japanese culture is a very bad thing. This is very similar to what we've already talked about with Taoism, that Taoism believes in a harmonious aspect of the universe. Yin and yang, the same principles apply here. And so it's important for you to keep harmony with the natural world. And the way you do that is practicing the 5 virtues of being honest, having high integrity, showing compassion for others, having the courage to do what is right, respecting those who are in positions higher of yourselves, or respecting people who deserve honor, and then having the wisdom to make the right choices within your life and the choices that could affect other people. Your actions speak volumes. And so all of these things help you to have a harmonious life and to keep yourself in connection with nature and with the kami. And so anytime you disrupt these things, anytime you're being dishonest, anytime you're not showing compassion, you're creating chaos. You're creating disharmony. And that's a very bad thing within Shinto and with Japanese culture. So again, you can see through these examples here of what practitioners of Shinto believe and do, that you can see it's about the present life. But again, there is some context of an afterlife within this. So the next thing that I want to talk about are the scriptures of Shinto and some of their prominent practices within Shinto. Like Buddhism, Shinto does not have any canonical scriptures. There is no Bible, there is no Quran, there is no Bible, Hebrew Bible and the Talmud. There's no combination of texts, the Vedas. There's nothing like that. Shinto is really a scripturalist culture and a scripturalist religion. However, there are a number of important texts that inform the religion and that inform scholars. And so we've already talked about some. So we've already talked about the Kojiki, the oldest Japanese text that was written, that it contains almost all of Japanese creation myths, its early mythologies, as well as the origin story to the imperial family of Japan. We've also talked about the Nihon Shoki, which was written just after the Kojiki, and that it's basically Japan's earliest chronicles, historical chronicles of their earliest histories, but it also contains a lot of mythological elements as well as some historical elements once you get closer to date of when it's written. But it does contain a lot of mythology as well. The other two texts that we haven't talked about that are very important within the study of Shinto is the Ingashiki, which is written around the 10th century in Japan. That includes a lot of the Shinto rituals and prayers that are done. And so this is, if we had to say what is the most important text within the Shinto religion, I would say it's this one. But, it's more like a prayer book. Designed, it's a book for priests, not so much individuals to possess. And then there's also the Kogo Shui, which was written in the 11th century and includes a number of myths not found in the Kojiki or the Nihon Shoki as well. But overwhelmingly, Shinto is not a religion concerning a book, not like Christianity, Judaism, or Islam. It's not like Sikhism as well. The heart of the religion is a religious textbook. No, and thus it's not an orthodoxy religion, meaning it's obsessed with having the right doctrines, the right teachings. Rather, Shinto, like Buddhism and to a large extent like Hinduism as well, it's an orthopraxic religion. It's about having the right practices. And so what are those practices? Well, the most visible aspect of Shinto practices are the Shinto shrines. And the Shinto shrines are known in Japan as jinja, the place, which is translated as the place of the kami. And there's probably around about 100,000 Shinto shrines in Japan. And Shinto shrines may be cared for by priests who are known as kannushi, or sometimes by local communities that house a Shinto shrine. There might be like a village elder who takes care of the temple or the shrine, or sometimes it's specific families, and sometimes these shrines are located on particular individual family properties, the shrines are really dedicated to a predominant family within the community, but thus that allow the outside community to participate in Shinto worship. The jinja typically consists of a physical complex, the shrine itself, a physical complex that has multiple buildings on its establishment, and and the structures within the shrine complex all have specific meanings to the religion and to the practitioners. So I'm going to only mention here the most important of these structures, because again, there's probably about 15 structures that make up a Shinto shrine, but here I'm only going to list just a small handful that are the most iconic and the most visible, or that have the greatest meaning within Shinto. So the first of these is the torii, which is the most iconic symbol of Japanese culture and Japanese religion. And you actually see it there on the slide there at the bottom of the image. It's the famous iconic gateway to a Shinto shrine. And what the torii represents is it symbolically marks the transition between the mundane and that which is sacred. It's a transition point for the individual, that they're walking from the profane into a sacred area. And so, as well as it's a procession area for the spirit of the kami as well. Because if you remember, a kami is never in a singular location. They're constantly moving. And so the gateway is like the first avenue in which the kami moves from the shrine and out of the shrine. So it's an extremely important place. The next thing that you will see is the kozua, which is a water pavilion, basically used in the ceremony, the purification ceremonies that we've already discussed. That at the kozua, worshippers are supposed to wash their left hand first, and then they'll wash their right hand, then they'll wash their mouth, and then finally they'll wash the handle that they used, because there's like a ladle that they use to draw the water out from the well or from the reservoir, and they'll use it to pour on their left hand, dip it back into the water, pour on their right hand, drink and wash their face, wash their mouth, and then they'll dip the entire ladle into the water to purify it, because they touched it as well. And so it's the main aspect of what a practitioner of Shinto does prior to entering the temple complex, or the shrine complex. The next icon that is really extremely famous within Japanese culture that exists outside of the Shinto shrines, and that's the toro, which are those decorative, iconic stone lanterns that you typically think of Japanese culture, Japanese gardens, stuff like that. They're very prominent, and typically they line the pathway from the torii, the gateway. They line the pathway that an individual takes straight to the main shrine where the kami resides, or to the main worship hall that the practitioners go and pray to. So it's illuminative. Basically, it really has no religious purposes other than illumination, but it's a very iconic symbol. The next, it might, like I said, it might have some religious context. I want to caution myself. I'm not the greatest expert in Shinto, so it might have some religious context, but from my knowledge and reading of Shinto religion, it really doesn't. It's just decorative, but it's an iconic decorative. Okay, so the next, let me transition to the next. The next is known as Emma, and it basically is a small wooden. It contains a bunch of series of small wooden plaques in which worshippers of Shinto write their prayers on. So you can see an image of it up on the screen there. That write their prayers, their wishes on pieces of paper, and that they hang these pieces of paper on the plaque. And the reason that these prayers are hung up is related to the belief that the kami, because again, the kami moves to and fro from the shrine to other shrines. It's a mobile god. And so because they hang their prayers up there, the belief that the kami will pass by the Emma and read the prayers and answer them. And another reason that the prayers are hung at the shrine is that they remain there until a ritual takes place that the Shinto priest will collect all of the prayers and will ceremonially burn them at a special event, which is a symbolic liberation of the prayer or the wish of the writer. So if a person, a couple comes, a young Japanese couple that just recently got married and they're struggling to either have a pregnancy or they're about to start their pregnancy, they might write that prayer on the piece of paper asking for the kami to bless their child, to bless the ability to be pregnant, to have a conception. And so you can see then when the priest burns the pieces of paper, the wishes rise up to the kami as well, and as a symbolic that, I guess in the sense that the kami will answer the prayer as well. And so emas are very common within Shinto practices. And they were even so much common that they even became adopted by Japanese religious practices there in Japan. So if you go to a Japanese Buddhist temple, you'll also see an Emma there, and it became a very common practice among Japanese Buddhists as well. And then you'll also see, there's also the Heiden, which is basically a worship hall for the practitioners. It's the largest building on a Shinto temple complex, shrine complex. And it's a place that provides space for ceremonies, special ceremonies, or for worshipers, average practitioners to come and to worship, to venerate the kami. But the most sacred place is the Honden. And I have a picture of a Honden up on the slide up there on the top right. And so it's the most sacred place, the most sacred building in a Shinto shrine complex, and it's the inner sanctuary, and it's where the kami, when he does visit the Shinto shrine, it's where the kami resides. The honen is generally protected from the public access by a fence. So you can see there's a small little fence there known as the tamegaki, and its doors are usually kept closed, but they're only open during religious festivals. And only the Shinto priest enters and opens the doors and enters this area for rituals. Inside the Hoden is kept the Go-Shinta, which is this sacred place, or not really the sacred place. It's considered the sacred body of the kami. But however, the Go-Shinta is not actually divine. It's rather seen as a temporary repository, because again, the kami moves. So it's not the kami itself, but it's just this temporary representation of him. And inside the shrine as well, there is sometimes a statue of the kami. It's very rare to find a statue, any type of iconographic figure of a kami, because not many of the kamis have a physical representation. But typically what all of the shrines will have inside of them is a mirror or several mirrors. And so you're asking yourself, well, why mirrors? Well, within Shinto culture, a mirror is used to represent the kami, because it is a belief, because a mirror is a representation of purity and truth. A mirror is not going to lie. You might have, again, all of us have an idea of what we look like. We have a representation of ourselves in our mind, but yet when we look at ourselves in the mirror, we say, "Oh my God, my face is covered in zits," or "Oh my God, I put on 10 pounds. I'm kind of look quite fat in this dress," but in my mind, I think, "Oh, I look fantastic," or "Oh, my hair is just god awful," but you think in your mind your hair is set right, is done well. So again, a mirror is an object of truth. It's always going to reveal the truth. And so mirrors reflect what's in front of the believer, and it's thus seen as a way of reflecting the kami. And that, again, the kami doesn't have a physical body, but the kami resides in all things, and so it resides in you. So you're seeing the kami by seeing yourself. So mirrors are a way to connect with the kami, because you are seeing the kami residing within you. And the last thing that I want to talk about is many Shinto practitioners also have what is known as family shrines, or kami shelves, known as kami dana, inside their homes. And these are usually consist of a singular shelf, sometimes two shelves, placed on a wall, or some type of elevated position within the most common area, aka the living room. And these kami shelves are found in Japan at the workplace. They're often found at Japanese restaurants, usually behind the counter, the cash registers, where the kami shelf is located inside a true Japanese restaurant. Sometimes shops, same, behind the counter, the register, and as well as ocean going vessels as well. They'll have a kami shelf. Sometimes they're in public places, and you can buy them as well in public places too. So a lot of people who aren't Shinto but who have a high value of Japanese culture will often go to Japan to buy these kami shells on the streets. So the next thing that I want to talk about is the combination of Shinto and Buddhism. And so, as I mentioned before, Shinto is a synchronistic religion, that it's synchronized with elements of Buddhism. And so this synchronization is known as Shinbutsu Shugo. And this refers to the synchronization of both Shinto and Buddhism, and that was the major organizing religion of Japan for several centuries, up until the late 19th century, until the Meiji Restoration and Meiji period of Japanese history. So again, when Buddhism was introduced to Japan during the Asuka period, which is the Asuka period is like 592 to 710 CE. The Japanese tried to reconcile their new beliefs that they had seen with older Shinto beliefs. The overwhelming majority of the Japanese simply saw and recognized the Buddha and the various Bodhisattvas as merely other kami. And so many of the Japanese saw the Buddha as a banshin, which is usually translated as foreign gods, but I like the more vulgar term, barbarian gods, that are often used, but it's just foreign gods, foreign invaders to Japanese culture at that time. And there was also a fear that there would be ramification upon the Japanese people if it allowed the entry of this foreign god into Japan. And so most famously it was indicated by a prominent family clan member and member of the royal court during the Asuka period, known as Mononobe no Osoki, who his writings are actually preserved in traditions, in Japanese traditions, who stated, quote, "The kami of our land will be offended if we worship a banshee." So these foreign kamis. Thus, a conflict arose uh, between the two religions, and it was really a political conflict, not really a religious one in Japanese history. Shortly following Buddhism's entry into Japan and its induction into the royal court, the Soga clan, who favored Buddhism and who really favored Japanese and Chinese relations, was basically came into open conflict with the other predominant Japanese clans of the time period, who were opposed to Buddhism. But the conflict, again, was really a power struggle within the imperial court and having those connections with China at the time. But Buddhism was not a passive religion in its assimilation to Japanese culture, nor is it a passive religion in all cultures that it encounters. It's very much a missionary religion and evangelistic in its history. And so Buddhism, throughout its history, finds easier ways to help the assimilation process of natural citizens or indigenous cultures to its religion, and to help the religion itself be assimilated by the natives. Buddhism often incorporates elements of indigenous religions and actively finds ways to demonstrate how Buddhism is really the same, either by adopting the religious vocabulary of the indigenous cultures that Buddhism is evangelizing to, or just out and out adopting the indigenous deities and converting them to animations of either the Buddha himself, that, oh, this kami is actually describing the Buddha. You just didn't know that that was his name. It's the same person. Or that it's these other kamis are become bodhisattvas as well. And that's really the tradition. Traditionally, Japanese history speaks of four key movements and four key ideologies that helped Buddhism assimilate with Shinto and with Japanese culture. And so we're going to talk about these. So the first one that we've kind of already just discussed it here, but however, I want to mention it again. It relates to how the Japanese and the followers of Shinto saw Buddhism. They saw the Buddha as a kami. Many Japanese saw the Buddha as merely just another kami, as we've already stated, and that it easily fit within the religious system. It's just another kami that you need to venerate or don't need to venerate. And while Shinto is often characterized as an animistic religion, it is really a polytheistic religion as well, believing in a pantheon of supernatural deities. And so adding one more kami to a pantheon of deities is really no big thing. It's really a small deal within Japanese cultures. And we already see that pattern in other cultures, particularly what we know of from the ancient Near Eastern religions and cultures, when the Greeks and Romans encountered new cultures and their deities. They absorbed them into Greek and Roman pantheons. So the most famous examples, most Greeks and Romans saw the Egyptian goddess Isis, as the Greeks saw Isis as, oh, this is Hera, the cohort of Zeus, the queen of heaven. The Romans saw it as Juno, the wife of Jupiter, who was also the queen of heaven. Later on, we see that the Romans would later construct temples dedicated to Isis in the city of Rome itself, and allowed people to worship the Egyptian gods as a separate thing, indicating that some saw Isis as a separate deity within the pantheon. That at first they saw them as the same thing, but then later saw them as separate, but absorbed them into their own pantheon of gods. The same thing applies with Buddhism and Shinto here. The Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, was seen as just a kami who appeared in the world as a human. And the Japanese quickly, some of them, majority of them quickly accepted it because, again, it's no small thing. They already believe in a host of other kamis. What's adding one more to it? The second ideological movement and historical movement was reconciling the Mahayana Buddhist concept of a bodhisattvas with the kami. If you recall from our lectures on Buddhism, and particularly within the Mahayana tradition, there was the notion of a bodhisattva. And a bodhisattva refers to an individual who is destined to become a Buddha through their own spiritual enlightenment. But instead of transitioning to a Buddha and achieving nirvana and escaping from samsara, out of a deep sense of compassion for others, these individuals forego their Buddhahood and decide to stay in a mediary plane and in a mediary role in order to aid others in achieving their own journey towards enlightenment. And so they're venerated and celebrated, similar to, as we talked about then, similar to Catholic saints. That's the explanation as to why the Buddha is so important, worthy of respect, consideration, and veneration, is because of the aspect of his nature. That the Buddha is compassionate, a compassionate bodhisattva. And so this blended well with the kamis, who are also seen as compassionate individuals and beings as well. Thus, this connects very well within Shinto beliefs about kamis as a guardianship, kamis having a duty to humanity. And so Mahayana Buddhists use this connection to help the Japanese accept the Buddha as a kami of compassion, or other Buddhas, bodhisattvas, as kamis of compassion. Third, using Buddhist ideology to explain the origins, the existence, and the purpose of the kami. So according to Buddhism, kamis became, now, once Buddhism became accepted and ingrained into Japanese cultures, Buddhism tried to elevate their religion above Shinto. And so they became a way to explain how a kami emerged and existed. And so so how they explained it is that a kami was a lost being in the need of liberation, like other sentient beings. And so kamis, because of that, are subject to karma, are subject to samsara, just like any other individual. And if you recall, within Buddhism, Buddhism doesn't believe and doesn't teach in permanence. There is no such thing as immortality. That everything, including the gods themselves, are subjected to death, are subjected to suffering, are subjected to the endless life cycle of samsara. And so thus even the kami, once Buddhism became ingrained into Japanese culture, the kamis then became subjected to the same fate as individuals, experience suffering, are caught in an endless cycle of samsara and need liberation. They need to achieve moksha and nirvana. And if you recall also from Buddhism, it is karma, the actions, the intentions of the individual that binds them to an endless cycle of samsara. And thus, in Buddhism, good intentions lead to good karma, bad intentions lead to bad karma, and good intentions lead to true happiness and enlightenment, while bad intentions only lead to suffering. And so, thus, the task became a part of Buddhism and Shinto, that the task was to help these suffering kamis to transition, to achieve liberation. And the task became assumed by the Buddhist monks. The Buddhist monks would claim that, yes, they could improve the situation of the kami's karma, through special rites. And so that you as a layperson could improve the karma of the kami. Similar, like how the religious doctrine of dhyana, of providing substance to a monk, it helps you incur good merit. It helps you incur good karma, because you're helping them achieve enlightenment. So the same principles of dhyana was placed upon the kami as well. And so through ritualizations, through prayers, through veneration, you're helping the kami achieve enlightenment and escape from the cycles of samsara. So soon Buddhist monks would start to build Buddhist temples right next to, or even inside, Shinto shrine complexes. Eventually, this situation produced what is known in Japanese as Shin Jusha, which is a shrine temple complex, which in turn accelerated the amalgamation process, where Buddhist priests would then start performing Shinto ceremonies, and vice versa, that soon Shinto priests started performing Buddhist temple ceremonies as well, and rituals. And finally, the last important ideology emerged around the 9th century with the concept of Honji Sujaku, which is that all kamis are Bodhisattvas. And so Honji Sujaku is a Japanese religious concept, again, that was created around the 9th century, that states that the kami of Shinto are manifestations of Bodhisattvas, and that these two sets of deities are not separate, but are simply different expressions of the same reality. Meaning, a kami is a bodhisattva. They're not, no longer are they separate things. They're now one and the same. And so the Buddha is not just another kami. The Buddha becomes synonymous with the same kami. So early Buddhist monks did not doubt the existence of kami, but rather saw them as inferior deities to the Buddha. But thus they encouraged Shinto followers to accept more and more Buddhist traditions. Now, by the 9th century and 10th century in Japan, they're one and the same. Buddhism doesn't see Shinto as inferior. They see them as one and the same. Just a different language, but speaking the same truth. So in turn, Shinto kamis like what's his name? Amaterasu. Yeah, Amaterasu becomes the Bodhisattva Kanan in Japanese culture, which is the same as in China of Gaiying, who is the Buddha of compassion. And because of this change in attitude, new Bodhisattvas would appear within Mahayana traditions that are purely Japanese. And so, for example, Hachimen is a synchronization of a kami turned Bodhisattva that becomes vitally important to the samurai clan, particularly of medieval Japan, and is seen as the protectorate of the imperial family. And so this kami now becomes its own separate Bodhisattva within Japanese Buddhism and within Mahayana traditions as well. And so you have an adoption of a new Bodhisattva that comes from Japan. However, I need to emphasize too that not all Buddhism accepted Shinto religion. Not all Mahayana Buddhists in Japan accepted this synchronization between Buddhism and Shinto. Those who were followers of the Pure Land Buddhism, in Japan, Pure Land Buddhism is known as Jodo, renounce kami worship due to the notion that kamis were inferior to Amid Buddha, and that Amid Buddha is the one that you should have soul veneration for, because faith in Amid Buddha is the primary way and practice that can an individual can only attain enlightenment and nirvana and thus achieve moksha. So, within Pure Land Buddhism, there was a specific Bodhisattva that they venerated. So they didn't take kind to accept other forms of Bodhisattvas, like the kami. Those who were followers of Nichiren Buddhism, Nichiren himself was very critical of Shinto, believing that it was a false religion that led people away from the true path of enlightenment. And he argued that Shinto was based on the worship of false gods and false spirits and did not really offer any hope of salvation, that the only hope of salvation for an individual was found in the Lotus Sutra, which becomes the heart of that religion's, really the heart of that religion. And it's also important to note that not all Shinto followers accepted this synchronization with Buddhism as well. There was a tendency in medieval and even in early modern periods of Japan to keep some kami separate from Buddhism. This tendency is known in Japanese culture and history as Shinbutsu Kakuri. Many Shinto followers felt that by combining beliefs surrounding the kami and the Buddhas, it was very disrespectful to the kami. And it was an explanation as to why natural disasters kept occurring in Japan, or why there was hard economic times, or why there was political instability in Japan, because again, the commies weren't happy. They weren't happy with this synchronization. So for an example, according to historical records from the Isa Jinju Buddhist temple, it's a very famous Buddhist temple in Japan that has kept historical records about its own self, that the community around the temple were forced to rebuild the temple twice because it was destroyed by flooding and mudslides in the area. And so the community believed that they had dishonored the kami within this region. And so the temple was actually, at one period of time, I think around this I think it was around the 9th century, if not maybe a little bit later, that they were, sorry, it was later. I think it was around the 15th century, that the temple was forced to relocate because another impact had happened. And so they're like, hey, 3 times is the charm here, rebuilding this temple because of natural disasters. And the 3rd time was the charm. The temple is still standing today. And so, again, the point of that illustration, that analogy, is that there was this belief that they had disrespected the kamis. And so you had Buddhist monks who moved the temple away from a region because there was some aspects that some of the kamis should be kept separate and not seen as being inclusive. And there was a conscious desire to some of the kamis to keep away from Buddhism. And so in some areas of Japan, Buddhist practices were completely outlawed in order to not disrespect the kamis. And finally, in 1868, during the Meiji government that they had issued uh, uh, what is known as the Kami and Buddha separation order, which created a period of action and attitude that's known in Japan as a period of sorry, Habutsu Kishaku, which is known as the destruction of Buddhism. So it was a very violent period in the 1870s where Japanese individuals attacked Buddhist shrines, Buddhist temples, even Buddhist priests, destroying temples, confiscating their wealth, burning their scriptures, and forcing Buddhist monks to even recant their vows and go back to lay practices and being lay people. The last thing that I want to talk about is state Shinto. And it is state Shinto refers to specifically the imperial Japan's ideological and purposeful use of Japanese folk religions and traditions of Shinto and creating a new kind of hybrid religious movement in order to control religious institutions in the country, but also to promote patriotism and loyalty to the emperor in Japan. Scholars argue that state Shinto reflects a desire for political control by the government rather than religious belief systems. And so thus some religious scholars argue that state Shintoism or state Shinto should not be treated as a new religious movement that emerged in the late 19th and early 20th century in Japan. They typically cite that the Meiji government's own language at the time called state Shinto a, quote, non-religious moral tradition. So even state Shinto, the Meiji government was saying, hey, we're not creating a new religion here. Furthermore, the term state Shinto was in fact an invented term. So it's not even a native term to the Japanese. It's an invented term created by the U.S. military following World War II in order to differentiate the ideological practices of the state from traditional Japanese practices. And following Japan's defeat in 1945, the U.S. military issued the Shinto Directive that decreed established Shinto, state Shinto as a religion, is banned, and that further ideologies used by Shinto by the state was banned as well. So this is why some scholars say it's not a state religion, because they recognize it as a political ideology. I, on the other hand, disagree. And that's why I'm including here why state Shinto is so important. And so, but how do we get to state Shinto? It's important for us to know how we get to the relationship, to this exact relationship between the state and Japanese culture. And the issue of state Shinto is attributed to really two key factors that we must talk about. So the first of it is the arrival of Christianity in Japan, as well as the arrival of Western influences. So the emergence of state Shinto is a direct correlation with the arrival of Christianity in Japan and the influences of Western powers in Japan. Christianity first arrived in Japan through Portuguese sailors and traders who sought to establish a trading network with the country from the Philippines, from Goa, India as well. Initially, the Japanese believed that Christianity was just an Indian faith, a new Indian faith, because most of the Portuguese who arrived in Japan came from Goa, India, as well as had several Indians as being ship hands. So part of the crew, Indian Christians who had recently converted to Catholicism as part of the crew, and so thus this confusion initially happened. And if you think about it too, if you remember, Buddhism also originated as an Indian religion, and so Japan's quite aware of Buddhism, and so just kind of dismissed it initially. However, prior to Christianity's and Europe's arrival to Japan, the country had been and was succumbed to a period of civil wars and social upheavals throughout the 15th and 16th century, where various samurai warlords and clans fought each other over control of Japan and fought for influence within the imperial court. This power vacuum led to some warlords to believe that being more open to external sources of power and legitimacy as a way and as a method of gaining an advantage during the Civil War. So several Japanese daimyos and samurai warlords became and their subjects converted to Christianity in order to gain sources of power, influence, and money from Christian and Western powers. And so the Christian and Western powers saw this as a win-win for them, because if these warlords and daimyos succeed, that only allows them to get more and more of a greater foothold and access to trading with Japan. The result of this led to the destruction of several Buddhist and Shinto temples and shrines, and with the Jesuit priests also contributing to the destruction and persecution of Buddhist and Shinto followers during this period. The apex of Christian influence really occurred during the reign of Oda Nobunaga, if I remember his name right, Nobunaga, who reigned from 1578 until 1582. So a very short reign, but that was the apex of Christian power and influence in Japan. It changed with the ascension of his son. The influence of Christianity in Europe started to decline following the Lateran Edict that was issued by Toyotomi Hideyoshi, to say it right, in 1587, in which he banned missionary activities and limited the trading practices in Japan with European powers. And once it became known that the Spanish government of the Philippines, Francisco de Sandri Picon, was the Spanish governor at the time. When it became known that he had plans for an active invasion of the Spanish army to Japan, and that they were going to force the Christianization of the people, and that this plan began to circulate among the Christian Catholics and missionaries and priests in Japan, Christianity's time on the island was up. Once it realized that Spain was going to use the Christian communities, the networks of Christian missionaries, to overthrow the government, Christianity's time on the island was up. And so it was during the Tokugawa shogunate, and between the years of 1614 until 1632, that they began a methodological eradication of Christianity on the islands of Japan via either executions of Catholic priests, persecution of Japanese Christians, and decrees in order to solidify the country in power by expelling all foreign influences in the country. In turn, the Tokugawa shogunate issued and maintained a policy of isolation and foreign avoidance for the nation of Japan for several centuries. But the situation changed in Japan in 1853 when the United States Navy, under the command of Matthew Perry, sailed straight into Edo Bay, which is modern day Tokyo, and forced the Japanese to end their isolation with the West through by basically pointing cannons at the imperial temple, saying, "Hey, our imperial complex," into the village, saying, "Hey, we'll bomb the hell out of you if you don't agree with us." Immediately, Western powers became accepted in Japan, and immediately they imposed what became known as the unequal treaties in Japanese history, in which stipulated that Japan must allow citizens of the country to visit of their countries to visit and reside within Japan, and must not levy taxes on any imported goods, or that these traders can't, not traders, but merchants is the better word, that they can't be held accountable in Japanese court. This was seen as a big failure, a huge failure. And so the shogunate's failure to oppose Western powers angered many Japanese, especially among the samurai clans. And this inspired a nationalist movement within Japan on an emphasis of returning Japan back to its cultural roots. And many of them adopted the slogan of Sono Joi, which is reverence for the emperor, expel the barbarians. And so Japan found itself in a mini civil war in which pro-imperial forces fought against people who favored westernization. And the pro-emperor camp won, thus ending the Edo period. And so that's important to note for the rise of state Shintoism. The second is the emergence of Kokugaku. So this is an ideology, it's a philosophical and academic movement, really. Kokugaku originated during the very later portions of the Edo period, which worked to refocus Japanese scholarship and culture away from the dominant influences of China, aka Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, in favor, and later Western cultures, in favor of early Japanese classics and early Japanese philosophy. The Kokugaku was popularized by a Japanese philosopher and poet, Hirota Atsutuna, who lived around the late 18th century, early 19th century, who criticized the repressive and demoralizing nature of Buddhism and Chinese influences within Japan, and tried to reestablish Chinese culture as it should be before the influx of these foreign influences and thought and behavior in their culture that had severely weakened their society and culture. The core tenet of the Kokugaku school of thought held that Japanese national character was naturally pure, and that it would reveal its inherent splendor once foreign powers and influences, aka China and later Western powers, were removed. It articulated that the foreign heart, sometimes translated as the Chinese heart, was considerably different from the pure heart or the true heart, that is, the original Japanese culture and philosophy, and that this true spirit, this true Japanese heart, needed to be revealed by removing 1,000 years of Chinese influence, learning, and later rejecting Western influences. I wanted to make a side note here that while during the Meiji period, so the Meiji period again is from 1968 until 1912, or 1868 to 1912, that there was a clear embrace of Western influences. However, Japan sought to modernize and adopt Western influences in accordance with Japanese culture and tradition, meaning that Japan modernized but did it the Japanese way. And the reason they did it, the reason that Japan and the Meiji emperor wanted to modernize Japan was not to be like the West, but actually to beat the West, to be dominant of the West. Because to prevent another time period again where, like that in 1853, where the U.S. can roll straight into Tokyo Harbor with steel ships and big cannons and can blast the city away. And the city had no gunpowder, had no guns. They had bows and arrows, swords, and horses. And here comes this steel boat with cannons that can blast away anything. And so the Japanese had never seen anything like this. And so the Japanese wanted to copy what they saw, but then do it the Japanese way. And they use the Kokigaku movement to do it. So this movement spurred a sense of Japanese nationalism that emerged right at the end of the Edo period, that dismantled the previous shogunate and restored the emperor as an absolute monarch, and launching what is known in Japanese history as the Meiji Restoration, which saw the dramatic transformation of Japan from a medieval society into a modern state and a modern nation that soon became an empire, that soon started to conquer almost all of East Asia and almost all of the Asian Pacific Islands, and would subsequently help start World War II. Thus, state Shinto becomes a vehicle in which further solidification of power and authority of the emperor would be promulgated, while Japanese nationalism helped transform the country into a modern empire that would lead to World War II. So very quickly, I want to highlight at the end of this lecture some of the key characteristics of state Shinto. And so for the first massive key characteristic is that of the divine lineage of the emperor of Japan. The emperor of Japan was considered a kami, and this belief was based on the myth of the Emperor Jimmu, who is the legendary first emperor of Japan, who was considered a direct descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. Within state Shinto, the emperor was declared to be a manifested kami, or known as Arahitogami, and was to be viewed and worshipped as a living god. This belief was used to justify the emperor's absolute monarchy and his authority, and to promote Japanese nationalism. And furthermore, because of the emperor's divine status, he was also seen and served as the head of state Shinto religion. He was the chief priest. He was the pope, basically. Another key characteristic was that priests in shrines, Shinto shrines, were agents of the state. So because the emperor was viewed as the head of the religion of Shinto, therefore all elements of Shinto was seen as belonging to the emperor himself, and thus to the state. So all priests in Shinto shrines had to be registered with the state. Priests were registered and must seek state registration in order to be an ordained priest and to work at Shinto shrines. And all public Shinto shrines became state property. And for those Buddhist temples that were adjacent to Shinto shrines, became confiscated and became property of the state as well. Another key characteristic was that of political activism which benefited the state, also honored the kami. And so in 1875, the Japanese government issued what is known as the Takio Proclamation, which not only established Shinto as a state religion of Japan and affirmed the divinity of the emperor, it also codified what Shinto priests must teach. And so they taught us a couple of things. That number one, that all individuals must respect the kami and must have love for their country. Number two, that Shinto rituals were seen as civic duties that all citizens must perform. Three, that the five virtues of Shinto must be observed by all citizens in order to honor their kami as well as honor their country and honor their emperor. And four, reverence for the emperor and obedience to the will of the court superseded everything. So again, if the emperor said, hey, we're going to war with China, that was seen as a divine command. And by going to war with China was seen as honoring the emperor and honoring the kami, as well as honoring your country. Thus, for Japanese, doing Shinto would not only honor the kami, but it also honored the state. And honoring the state would honor the kami. So serving the state was seen as an act of worship. So being in the army, being a sailor, being a pilot for the Japanese military was an act of worship. Instinctively, the practices of Shinto became a corridor to promote, foster, and encourage Japanese nationalism and obedience to the imperial court. And fourth, practices which did not ally with state functions were increasingly prohibited. This directly relates to the clear desire and policy of the Japanese government to separate Buddhism as well as other elements from Shinto. And so this is known as the Shinbutsu Bonni, which we already discussed, and which, but we didn't really say why it was that. So when the new government seized power in 1868, they saw the natural movement of Shinto Butsura as a way to reduce the immense wealth and influence and power that Buddhism had in Japan. Because if you remember, Buddhism also advocated nonviolence. It advocated for a disattachment of things. And so these were all things counter to a modern country and modernizing country, and a country that wanted to value loyalty to the emperor, because again, nothing matters in Buddhism. And so Shinto was seen as an effective vehicle for true growth in Japan, and for growth of nationalism, modernization, and for imperialism. So the government publicly defrocked, which defrocked as a definition would be to remove an individual from a position or a station of power. So they would defrock all priests who performed Shinto and Buddhist ceremonies, that they weren't priests anymore, and force them to only perform Shinto rituals if they wished to be reinstated as priests. They banned the use of Buddhist terminologies and ideologies within Shinto, things like the Gogin, which is an idea of the manifestation of the Buddha as a kami. That was banned and prohibited from teaching, and forced a return to traditional Shinto values and traditions and ideologies. These policies naturally led to anti-Buddhist sentiments within the country that was known as the Habibutsu Kishukaku, that destroying of Buddhism, in which temples and images of the Buddha were destroyed or significantly damaged, and Buddhist monks were forced to forsake their vows and to join the secular world, and the wealth of the Buddhist temples were seized by the government. So much so as gold images, bronze bells were cast down and used as weapons or machinery, things like that. However, this campaign ultimately failed to destroy the influence of Buddhism on the Japanese people who still go to Buddhist ceremonies, primarily because of end of life ceremonies. A Japanese who might practice Shinto most of their life, instead of going to a Shinto shrine when their loved one dies, would go to a Buddhist temple instead. Because Buddhist ceremonies for funeral rites were more valued by Japanese, and so the Japanese culture valued Buddhist temples. And so Buddhist services are still prominent within Japan. The government was successful, however, in creating the impression that Shinto and Buddhism in Japan are completely independent religions. And so that's why now religious scholars treat them as independent religions. And that's why we speak of state Shinto in our study of world religions. And so this kind of ends our lecture on Shinto.